I am exploring what consciousness is, not in terms of thoughts, memories, or personality, but as the fundamental first-hand sensation of existence. It is that internal feeling of being aware which confirms my own being. Despite prolonged philosophical inquiry and extensive neuroscientific research, no one has yet been able to explain its origin or cause. This is not simply a void in our knowledge, it is a foundational mystery. The field of neuroscience has charted the brain with extraordinary precision. We have a grasp on how neurons ignite, how electrical signals propagate, and how sensory information is interpreted. Yet none of this clarifies the subjective aspect of experience, the reason why electrical activity within the brain should produce any sensation at all. Quantum theory, the most precise framework in physics, informs us that particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously, that entangled systems can have an instantaneous effect on each other over vast distances, and that the very process of observation appears to mold physical reality. I question whether this peculiar behavior might hold clues to the mechanics of consciousness. Tonight, we delve into the possibility that consciousness is founded upon quantum mechanics. We will trace the evolution of this notion from its philosophical genesis through the lenses of contemporary neuroscience, physics, and biology. Consciousness stands as the one phenomenon that each of us experiences directly. I might harbor doubts about everything else, the reliability of my memory, the accuracy of my perceptions, even the existence of the material world, but I cannot question the fact that I am conscious. The very occurrence of experience is the most immediate and undeniable aspect of human life. And yet, despite the significant strides made by science, we remain ignorant of how or why it occurs. Modern science has successfully elucidated an incredible array of phenomena. We comprehend the forces that steer galaxies, the architecture of atoms, the biological code contained within DNA, and the intricate pathways of the human brain. However, consciousness, the very faculty that enables our appreciation of these discoveries, continues to be an enigma. The scientific investigation of consciousness has traditionally been influenced by two opposing viewpoints. One perspective regards the mind as a mere consequence of physical operations in the brain. The other maintains that subjective experience may necessitate an explanation that transcends standard physical principles. For a large portion of the 20th century, mainstream science was focused almost exclusively on the former view. By the middle of that century, neuroscience had emerged as a formidable field. With the invention of instruments like electroencephalography or EEG, scientists were able to measure the brain's electrical activity. Subsequently, with technologies such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, researchers could observe various brain areas becoming active during different activities. These techniques provided a complex portrait. The brain is an electrical and chemical network of incredible complexity, comprising over 80 billion neurons and trillions of interconnections. From this information, scientists have learned a great deal. They managed to connect specific brain regions to distinct functions like vision, speech, memory, and emotion. They saw how injury to particular areas could modify perception or personality. The overarching message was unambiguous. The brain generates the mind. This concept became widely embraced. Nobel laureate Francis Crick, who co-discovered the DNA double helix, articulated this perspective starkly in his subsequent research on the brain. He stated, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Crick was convinced that a sufficiently detailed understanding of the brain's mechanisms would lead to a complete comprehension of consciousness. Nevertheless, as more data was gathered, a feeling grew that something was fundamentally missing. A pivotal moment in this shift occurred in the 1990s when the Australian philosopher David Chalmers coined the phrase, "the hard problem of consciousness." He drew a line between the easy problems, those concerning the explanation of behaviors and functions, such as how we identify faces or remember names, and the hard problem, which poses the question, why does subjective experience exist at all? Why does all this cerebral activity not simply unfold in the absence of any inner life? The hard problem is not concerned with what the brain does, but with what experience feels like. Why does the firing of neurons lead to the sensation of red, the taste of coffee, or the emotion of sorrow? And why should a brain, a physical object composed of atoms, give rise to awareness in the first place? This question resonated deeply. Even scientists who did not agree with Chalmers's conclusions acknowledged the validity of the question. Some viewed it as a philosophical conundrum. Others started to think that the mystery might allude to something more profound, something absent from our current scientific paradigm. The challenge is partly that consciousness is not something we can observe from the outside. We can monitor brain activity, but we cannot perceive what an individual is experiencing internally. Consciousness is inherently private, subjective, and first-person. Science, conversely, is founded on objective, third-person observation. This disparity generates a unique conflict. Despite this hurdle, researchers continued their work. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, cognitive scientists and neuroscientists persisted in mapping the correlations between brain states and mental states. They pinpointed neural activity patterns linked to attention, intention, and even particular kinds of dreams. The field of consciousness studies started to emerge, combining neuroscience, psychology, computer science, and philosophy. Organizations like the Allen Institute for Brain Science and the Human Connectomy Project furthered the detailed charting of brain networks. At the same time, researchers such as Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi put forward theoretical frameworks to explain how consciousness might arise from the brain's complexity. One of these, integrated information theory, aimed to measure the level of consciousness in a system by quantifying the amount of information it integrates among its components. Yet, even with these developments, no general agreement was reached. The chasm between neural activity and subjective experience remained stubbornly vast. It was as though science could explain the engine and its parts, but not why the machine suddenly started to have an internal feeling. This leads to a more fundamental question. Could our existing scientific instruments be intrinsically insufficient for tackling this problem? This is where quantum mechanics comes into the picture, not as a definitive answer, but as an intriguing possibility. Quantum physics is renowned for its strangeness. It indicates that particles lack definite properties until observed, that entangled particles can affect each other instantly across space, and that the act of observation itself appears to have a role in determining reality. These concepts, while rooted in mathematics and experimentation, defy our classical grasp of cause and effect. During the initial phase of quantum theory, a number of physicists speculated about whether consciousness could be part of the equation. John von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, and even Erwin Schrödinger mused on whether the observer's mind had a crucial part in the results of quantum phenomena. At that time, such notions were mostly philosophical. But as the hard problem of consciousness gained new prominence in the late 20th century, some scientists and theorists started to re-examine these old inquiries. Could consciousness itself be a quantum effect? Might the oddities of quantum mechanics offer a way to unravel the mystery of experience? This idea is contentious. A great number of physicists assert that using quantum mechanics to explain consciousness is both superfluous and lacks evidence. However, others are convinced that consciousness and quantum theory may be profoundly intertwined, with both pointing toward a more fundamental stratum of reality. If consciousness appeared to defy explanation by conventional science, then it becomes vital to understand the assumptions of that conventional science. Before quantum mechanics even became part of the discussion, the prevailing scientific model for explaining the mind was based on classical physics and computational theory. This model influenced decades of research in neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence, and it continues to be a cornerstone of the discussion today. The classical interpretation of consciousness is founded on a long-standing concept that the mind operates like a machine, with the brain as its hardware. This viewpoint developed alongside the emergence of classical physics in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers such as René Descartes envisioned the body as a mechanical apparatus subject to physical laws. Isaac Newton's laws of motion provided a strict framework for describing matter in motion, and it was a natural assumption that the human brain, like all other things in the universe, must adhere to these same principles. With time, this mechanical model of the brain grew more sophisticated. In the 19th century, breakthroughs in electricity and magnetism provided scientists with new means to comprehend how the brain might convey signals. It was discovered that the nervous system functions through electrical impulses. Neurons fired in patterns much like circuits in a telegraph network. For researchers of that period, this was more than a mere analogy. It was a structural plan. By the beginning of the 20th century, neurologists had made considerable advances in mapping the brain structure and pinpointing its functional areas. Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, for instance, had already identified the brain regions responsible for speech production and comprehension. Such discoveries implied that the mind could be analyzed and understood component by component, similar to any other machine. However, it was in the mid-20th century that the concept of the brain as a computational device truly took form. The ascent of computer science provided a fresh and compelling metaphor. If computers could receive input, process it logically, and produce output, then perhaps the brain operated in a similar, albeit vastly more intricate, manner. This notion was given a formal basis through the work of the British mathematician Alan Turing. In the 1930s, Turing proposed the idea of a universal machine, a theoretical model capable of simulating any computation. Decades later, this concept would be extended to biology. If the brain is a physical system, and if all physical systems abide by computable laws, then the brain must, in essence, be a type of Turing machine. This perspective was not confined to philosophers or mathematicians. In the post-war era, cognitive scientists started to develop models of perception, memory, and language that resembled computational processes. The mind was frequently depicted as software operating on the brain's hardware. This came to be known as the computational theory of mind, and it continues to be influential in both neuroscience and artificial intelligence. One of the foremost proponents of this view was the neuroscientist and molecular biologist Francis Crick. Following his research on the structure of DNA in the 1950s, Crick shifted his focus to the brain. In the 1990s, he authored The Astonishing Hypothesis, in which he contended that all facets of human experience, emotions, memories, and even free will, could be accounted for by the interactions of neurons and molecules. In Crick's own words, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." It was a stark perspective, but for many scientists, it was also an empowering one. If consciousness resulted from computation, then it could eventually be understood, replicated, and perhaps even engineered. This conviction motivated much of the initial work in artificial intelligence. Pioneers like Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy were confident that consciousness, or at least intelligence, could arise from sufficiently complex algorithms. If the brain was a machine, then the key to understanding consciousness was to reverse engineer it, deconstructing it into its circuits, pathways, and codes. In the meantime, neuroscientists forged ahead with mapping the brain's physical architecture. They found that neurons communicate via electrochemical signals at synapses, that different patterns of brainwaves are associated with various states of consciousness, and that brain regions form dynamic networks rather than operating as isolated units. The tools of classical physics and computation helped to elucidate these interactions with increasing detail. The broader implication was evident. The mystery of consciousness would ultimately be solved as more information was gathered. There was no need for mysterious forces or exotic physics. Just as 19th-century chemistry had dispelled the alchemical notion of a vital force, modern neuroscience would demystify the mind. This mechanistic belief extended even to philosophical circles. A school of thought called functionalism proposed that the crucial factor is not the system's substance, whether it is made of neurons or silicon, but its function. If a machine acts like a conscious entity, processes information in the same way, and interacts with the world similarly, then for all intents and purposes, it is conscious. However, this model, despite its power, omitted something significant. Even as researchers mapped the neural correlates of consciousness, the measurable patterns that accompany awareness, they were still unable to explain why those patterns produce experience. They could identify what occurs in the brain when a person feels pain, but not why that brain state is experienced as painful from within. They could pinpoint brain regions involved in visual processing, but not why seeing the color red feels different from seeing the color blue. This is the heart of the so-called explanatory gap. Classical neuroscience could describe the brain's structure and behavior with growing accuracy, but it could not make the leap from objective processes to subjective experience. This gap grew more apparent as researchers began to study patients with unusual neurological conditions. In cases of split brain surgery, for example, procedures that sever the corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres, patients sometimes acted as if two distinct streams of consciousness were present in one body. These discoveries suggested that consciousness might not be a singular unified process, but rather an emergent quality of multiple interacting subsystems. Yet, even in this context, the central question persisted. Why does any arrangement of subsystems feel like anything at all? The computational perspective also encountered philosophical objections. In the 1980s, philosopher John Searle presented the well-known Chinese room argument, which cast doubt on whether symbol manipulation, computation, was adequate for understanding or consciousness. A machine might process Chinese characters and provide correct responses without ever comprehending the language. The aim was not to deny that machines could simulate understanding, but to assert that simulation is not equivalent to experience. By the early 21st century, it had become apparent that neuroscience had achieved great progress in explaining the mechanics of the mind. But the essence of consciousness remained elusive, and this created an opening, however small, for other possibilities. Perhaps the tools of classical physics and computation, as potent as they were simply insufficient. Perhaps consciousness was not something that could be explained solely in terms of information processing or biological complexity, and perhaps a different framework, one that grapples with the fundamentally strange and indeterminate, might provide a different viewpoint. If the classical model of the brain, based on computation and electrochemical activity, finds it difficult to explain consciousness, then perhaps we need to venture beyond the conventional frameworks of physics itself. This path leads us directly into one of the most successful and perplexing theories in all of science: quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics was not conceived in a single moment or by a single individual. It emerged progressively throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries as physicists grappled with observations that did not conform to the established laws of classical physics. The initial fractures in the old model appeared in the late 1800s when Max Planck was studying blackbody radiation, how objects release heat. Classical theory predicted that hotter objects should emit an infinite amount of energy, particularly at shorter wavelengths. This ultraviolet catastrophe was clearly not observed in reality, and Planck offered a radical solution in 1900. Energy must be emitted in discrete packets, or quanta. Planck's idea was not immediately accepted as a revolution, but it planted a crucial seed. A few years later, in 1905, Albert Einstein built upon this concept to explain the photoelectric effect, the phenomenon where light can dislodge electrons from metal surfaces. Classical wave theory suggested that the intensity of light was the most important factor. However, experiments demonstrated that only light above a specific frequency could free electrons, irrespective of its intensity. Einstein proposed that light acts not only as a wave, but also as particles, which we now call photons, each possessing a quantum of energy. These early concepts pointed to a deeper layer of physical reality, one where the smooth, continuous world of classical physics was replaced by something far more granular and peculiar. In the subsequent decades, this new framework developed quickly. Niels Bohr introduced a model of the atom where electrons resided in discrete orbits, moving between them by absorbing or emitting specific energy quanta. Werner Heisenberg developed matrix mechanics, a novel form of mathematics for handling quantum systems, and in 1927 he established the uncertainty principle. According to Heisenberg, it is inherently impossible to know both the position and momentum of a particle with absolute precision. This was not a failing of measurement instruments, it was a fundamental characteristic of nature. Around the same time, Erwin Schrödinger formulated his wave equation, a mathematical formula describing how quantum systems change over time. Instead of viewing particles as tiny objects on definite trajectories, Schrödinger's equation treats them as wave-like phenomena spread across space, existing in a superposition of many possible states at once. This idea of superposition is a key feature of quantum mechanics. A quantum system does not exist in a single state like a classical object. Instead, it is in a combination of all potential states until it is measured. Upon measurement, it collapses into a specific outcome. This raised an immediate and profound question: what triggers the collapse? According to the prevailing interpretation of the time, developed mainly by Bohr and known as the Copenhagen interpretation, it is the act of measurement that forces a quantum system into a definite state. But what precisely constitutes a measurement? Is it the interaction with a measuring instrument, the involvement of an observer, or something else entirely? This ambiguity troubled many physicists, including Einstein. He famously opposed the idea that reality could be uncertain, remarking, "God does not play dice with the universe." He was convinced that quantum mechanics, despite its success, had to be incomplete, and that there were hidden variables that would eventually bring determinism back to physics. Nevertheless, experiment after experiment validated the predictions of quantum theory. Over the years, the success of the quantum framework only grew. It explained the behavior of atoms, electrons, and light with unparalleled accuracy. It led to the creation of semiconductors, lasers, magnetic resonance imaging, and numerous other technologies. The equations were effective. The predictions aligned with reality, but the underlying significance remained obscure. One of the more curious aspects of quantum mechanics is entanglement. When two particles become entangled, their properties are linked, regardless of the distance between them. A measurement on one particle instantly determines the state of the other, even across vast separations. This phenomenon was predicted mathematically and later verified in experiments, most famously by physicist Alan Aspect and his team in the 1980s. Entanglement challenges classical logic. It implies that the universe is, in a way, non-local, that events in one location can have an instantaneous effect on events elsewhere without any signal passing between them. This behavior was deeply disturbing to Einstein, who termed it spooky action at a distance. Yet it is a real phenomenon. It occurs, and no experiment to date has disproven it. Another characteristic of quantum mechanics is complementarity, the concept that particles can show different properties based on how they are measured. A classic illustration is the double-slit experiment. When particles like electrons are fired through two slits at a screen, they create an interference pattern typical of waves. However, if one tries to determine which slit an electron passes through, the interference vanishes and the pattern becomes that of particles. It is as if the particle is aware of being observed. This experiment, repeated in many forms over the decades, highlights a critical point. In the quantum realm, the observer seems to play a fundamental role in shaping outcomes. This observer dependence is at the core of the quantum puzzle. In classical physics, observation is a passive act. Measuring the speed of a baseball does not significantly change its path, but in quantum mechanics, the very act of measurement alters the system being observed. That observation could influence reality is not just counterintuitive. It is revolutionary, and it naturally leads to a question that has captivated scientists and philosophers alike. Could consciousness itself be part of this process? Some of the early pioneers of quantum theory speculated that it might be. John von Neumann, one of the most brilliant mathematicians of the 20th century, contended in the 1930s that no physical system alone could induce wave function collapse. In his perspective, the chain of measurement, from the quantum particle to the detector to the recording device, must ultimately conclude in something non-physical. He proposed that consciousness might fulfill that final role. Later, in the 1960s, physicist Eugene Wigner elaborated on this idea. He argued that the observer's mind is essential for a quantum system to become definite. In Wigner's interpretation, consciousness was not just an emergent quality of matter, it was a crucial participant in the unfolding of physical reality. These concepts were not widely accepted, and many physicists regarded them as speculative. Nonetheless, they posed provocative questions. If consciousness has a role in quantum processes, then perhaps the brain itself must be understood not merely as a classical machine, but as a quantum system. And if that is the case, then our understanding of both physics and consciousness might need to be revised. Before exploring these more speculative interpretations, it is essential to grasp the specific issue that initiated these discussions. The phenomenon that most directly challenges the line between physics and philosophy is the so-called measurement problem. What precisely occurs when a quantum system moves from a superposition of states to a single, definite result? To fully comprehend the peculiar connection between quantum mechanics and consciousness, we must address the central paradox at the heart of quantum theory, the measurement problem. It is an enigma that challenges our most fundamental beliefs about reality, what it is, when it exists, and what role, if any, the observer has in shaping it. The idea of measurement in classical physics is simple. You can measure the speed of a train, the temperature of a star, or the charge of a battery, and in doing so, you merely uncover what was already present. The act of measurement does not significantly affect the system. The world is assumed to exist independently of our observation of it. Quantum mechanics overturns this assumption. In the quantum world, particles lack fixed properties until they are measured. Instead, they are described by a mathematical function known as the wave function, which represents a superposition, a mixture of all possible states the particle could be in. When we take a measurement, this wave function seems to collapse, and the particle assumes a definite value, such as a specific position or momentum. This behavior is not just theoretical, it has been confirmed by numerous experiments. But what exactly makes the wave function collapse? And why does it collapse into one specific outcome over another? This is the measurement problem. The issue grows more confusing when we realize that, according to the standard principles of quantum theory, the evolution of the wave function is dictated by deterministic equations, specifically Schrödinger's equation. These equations describe a smooth, predictable progression of possibilities over time. There is no mention of collapse anywhere in these equations. The mathematics does not specify when or if the system should reduce to a single state. And yet, when we perform a measurement, that is precisely what we see. The particle is not in a blur of possibilities, it is in one definite state. To explain this, early quantum theorists proposed a dual process. One process, the unitary evolution of the wave function, dictates how quantum systems evolve over time when they are not being observed. The other process, collapse, happens abruptly and discontinuously when a measurement is taken. but this created a profound ambiguity. What exactly qualifies as a measurement? Does a Geiger counter measuring a radioactive particle count? What about a computer logging the result? Or does the collapse truly occur only when a conscious observer becomes aware of the outcome? This ambiguity gave rise to various interpretations of quantum mechanics. One of the most prominent, the Copenhagen interpretation, put forth by Niels Bohr and his colleagues, argued that quantum properties are not real until they are observed. Bohr highlighted the role of classical measuring devices and asserted that attempting to describe what happens between measurements was pointless. In this view, quantum theory describes not reality itself, but only our knowledge of it. Measurement is an interaction that produces classical outcomes from quantum systems, but it provides no deeper insight into the underlying reality. The observer, in a way, becomes a participant in defining what is real. This idea was deeply unsettling to many, including Albert Einstein. He dismissed the notion that the moon exists only when someone is looking at it. He was convinced that an objective reality must exist independently of observers, and he dedicated much of his later life to seeking a more complete theory. Others, however, took the measurement problem in a very different direction. John von Neumann, in his seminal book Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, published in the early 1930s, analyzed the measurement process with precise mathematical rigor. He concluded that if both the quantum system and the measuring apparatus are governed by the same quantum laws, then the act of measurement itself must be described as a quantum interaction. But this creates an infinite regress. If the system and the measuring device are both quantum, then we must also consider the observer's brain as part of the quantum system. At what point does the wave function collapse? Where does the chain of entanglement end? Von Neumann argued that the collapse must happen outside the physical chain, possibly in the consciousness of the observer. According to this view, the mind is not just a byproduct of the physical world. It plays a fundamental role in how physical reality manifests. Eugene Wigner, a Hungarian-American physicist and Nobel laureate, expanded on this argument. In the 1960s, he proposed a famous thought experiment known as Wigner's friend. Imagine a laboratory where Wigner's friend conducts a quantum measurement, say, determining whether a particle's spin is up or down. From the friend's perspective, the result is definite. But from Wigner's perspective outside the lab, the entire system, friend included, remains in a superposition. This leads to a paradox. Can two observers experience different realities? Is the friend's measurement real before Wigner learns the result? And does Wigner's awareness cause a second collapse? The implications are staggering. If consciousness has a unique role in causing wave function collapse, then consciousness is not merely a product of physics. It is a participant in the fabric of reality. It introduces an element of subjectivity into the core of the physical world. Of course, not all physicists agree with this interpretation. Many see the measurement problem as an indication that quantum mechanics is incomplete, or that we do not yet understand how to describe macroscopic measuring devices within a quantum framework. Others have proposed alternative interpretations that avoid invoking consciousness entirely. One such alternative is the many worlds interpretation proposed by Hugh Everett III in the 1950s. According to this view, the wave function never collapses. Instead, all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement actually happen, but in separate, branching universes. When you measure a quantum particle, you do not cause it to assume one value. Rather, the universe splits into multiple versions of itself, each containing a different result. In this framework, there is no need for an observer to cause collapse because nothing ever collapses. The wave function evolves deterministically, and the illusion of a single outcome is merely the result of our limited perspective. While elegant in its consistency, the many worlds interpretation presents its own challenges. It requires an almost infinite proliferation of parallel realities, none of which we can directly observe, and it leaves unanswered the deeper question of why we experience this particular outcome and not another. Other interpretations, such as decoherence theory, try to explain the appearance of collapse without involving the mind. Decoherence describes how quantum systems lose their quantum properties through interactions with their environment. When a particle becomes entangled with countless other particles, it effectively behaves like a classical object. But decoherence does not actually solve the measurement problem. It explains why quantum effects are not visible in the macroscopic world, but it does not explain why one outcome is experienced rather than another. Amid all these interpretations, the central mystery persists. The observer appears to be essential in quantum mechanics, but the theory does not tell us who or what the observer really is. Is observation a physical process like any other, or does it require a conscious mind? And here, the discussion begins to loop back to the subject of consciousness itself. If the mind cannot be reduced to classical computation, and if quantum theory cannot be fully described without reference to observers, then could these two unsolved puzzles be pointing toward the same underlying phenomenon? The idea that consciousness could cause quantum collapse might seem audacious, but it is not entirely without precedent. Quantum theory has long challenged our understanding of what is real and when it becomes real. And few thought experiments capture this dilemma more famously or more clearly than Schrödinger's cat. As the discussion over the role of observation in quantum mechanics continued, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger became increasingly worried about what he perceived as the theory's philosophical consequences. In 1935, in a now famous paper, Schrödinger described a simple yet unsettling scenario. His aim was not to endorse the idea that observation causes collapse, but rather to show the absurdity of that very notion when carried to its logical conclusion. Imagine a sealed container holding a cat, a tiny amount of radioactive material, a Geiger counter, a flask of poison, and a hammer. The mechanism is set up so that if a single atom decays, the Geiger counter will detect it, causing the hammer to shatter the flask and release the poison, killing the cat. If no decay happens, the cat remains alive. Radioactive decay is a quantum event. Until it is measured, the atom is in a superposition of both decayed and not decayed states. Consequently, the Geiger counter is also in a superposition of having detected and not detected radiation. The hammer, the poison, and eventually the cat become entangled in this quantum uncertainty. According to the Copenhagen interpretation, until someone opens the box and takes a measurement, the cat is simultaneously both alive and dead. This conclusion contradicts our everyday experience. It conjures an almost surreal image, a cat suspended between life and death until a human observer intervenes. Schrödinger's point was that the theory, when taken literally, leads to paradoxes when applied to the macroscopic world. And yet, this is not just a philosophical exercise. Schrödinger's cat illustrates a genuine issue in quantum theory, the boundary between the quantum and the classical. At what scale does the wave function collapse? Is it when a particle interacts with a detector, when a biological system reacts, or only when a conscious observer gets involved? The cat-in-the-box scenario compels us to consider the possibility that reality stays indefinite until it is observed, and that observation, far from being passive, might be what creates the outcome. This is the core of the observer effect, the idea that observation is not just a window into reality, but an active participant in shaping it. The thought experiment also brings up the question of where the boundary lies between quantum ambiguity and classical definiteness. In the quantum realm, particles can be in multiple states, but in our world, cats are either alive or dead. Why is there such a distinct transition, and what determines that boundary? This so-called quantum classical divide is still one of the major unresolved questions in physics. Decoherence theory, developed in the late 20th century, provides one partial solution. It describes how quantum systems lose their superposition when they interact with their environment. Through this interaction, the quantum system becomes entangled with so many other particles that interference patterns are lost and classical behavior emerges. In the Schrödinger's cat scenario, decoherence would happen extremely quickly. The interaction between the atom and the Geiger counter, or between the cat and the surrounding molecules, would cause the system to decohere before any human opened the box. From this perspective, the cat is either alive or dead long before it is observed. But decoherence, while useful, does not solve everything. It explains why quantum effects become hidden in large systems, but it does not explain why a specific outcome is experienced. It tells us how a quantum system appears to collapse, but not why this particular result manifests rather than another. The measurement problem, in essence, remains. Schrödinger's cat also serves another purpose. It highlights how deeply quantum uncertainty is intertwined with knowledge and information. The system exists in a superposition not because of what is happening inside the box, but because of what we do not know until we look. This has led some physicists and philosophers to propose that information, and not just matter or energy, may be fundamental to the nature of reality. John Archibald Wheeler, a prominent American physicist and a colleague of both Einstein and Bohr, coined a famous phrase, "it from bit." According to Wheeler, all physical things, the its of the world, ultimately get their meaning and existence from binary yes or no answers to questions or bits of information. In this view, reality is built not from matter, but from acts of measurement. Every observation, every quantum interaction, is a kind of question put to nature, and the answer, yes or no, up or down, brings something into existence. This information-centric perspective aligns with the idea that the observer plays an essential role in quantum processes. It also invites us to consider whether consciousness is not just another information processor, but something more, something uniquely suited to receive or even generate these fundamental bits of reality. Schrödinger's cat, then, is not merely a quirky thought experiment. It is a portal into the deeper philosophical implications of quantum theory. It forces us to face the limits of what we can say about reality when no one is observing, and it raises the unsettling possibility that the very act of observation might be what makes reality real. There is also something deeply human in this paradox. We are accustomed to a world where things exist independently of our awareness, where a tree falls in a forest, whether or not anyone hears it. But quantum mechanics suggests that, at a fundamental level, the universe may not be so indifferent, that our observation, our consciousness, might play a participatory role in shaping the very structure of events. This is not to say that the mind controls matter or that the observer possesses magical abilities. Rather, it suggests that the act of observation is inseparable from the phenomena being observed. In a quantum world, the observer and the observed constitute an indivisible whole. This idea, while profoundly challenging, does not necessarily mean that consciousness is mystical or beyond science. It may instead point to the need for a new scientific framework, one that includes the observer not as an afterthought, but as a central element. But if the observer is essential, then what kind of observer are we discussing? Is it sufficient to use a camera or a computer? Or does it require something conscious, self-aware, capable of knowing? The implications of Schrödinger's cat were never intended to suggest that the universe depends on our minds. Yet, over time, the strangeness of quantum mechanics continued to raise one compelling question. What if consciousness is not just involved in quantum measurement, but is somehow necessary for it? From the very beginning of quantum theory, physicists struggled with this possibility. As we have seen, figures like John von Neumann and Eugene Wigner suggested that consciousness might be the final element in the measurement chain, the entity that transforms potential into actual. This concept, though often opposed by the mainstream, never completely disappeared. It remained on the periphery of theoretical physics and philosophical discussion, unresolved and controversial, but never insignificant. As the 20th century advanced, the problem became more profound. The more precisely quantum experiments were conducted, the more robust the theory became, and the more perplexing its implications grew. There was no longer any doubt about whether quantum particles behaved probabilistically. That had been confirmed repeatedly. What was still unclear was why the probabilities collapsed into certainties only when measured. Could it truly be that the presence of a conscious observer resolves the uncertainty? Eugene Wigner certainly believed so. In his writings from the 1960s, Wigner contended that the wave function collapse could not be explained by physical systems alone. He pointed out that if one included the measuring device, the laboratory, and even the experimenter's body as part of the quantum system, the superposition should persist. But when the experimenter becomes aware of the result, it is no longer a superposition. That awareness, he proposed, plays a special role. In Wigner's own words, it was not possible to formulate the laws of quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness. This was a bold assertion. If true, it would mean that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of matter. It is a fundamental part of the universe's machinery. Yet many physicists were uneasy with this conclusion. They feared it introduced subjectivity into a field that had always strived for objectivity. If science needed consciousness to function, did that not blur the line between physical law and personal experience? Still, the question lingered. What is it about consciousness that makes it a candidate for resolving quantum indeterminacy? What distinguishes it from a camera, a clock, or a computer? To address this, we must consider what consciousness appears to do. It integrates information across time and space. It links sensory input, memory, emotion, intention, and attention into a unified experience. More importantly, it reflects upon itself. Consciousness knows that it is conscious. This reflexivity, this awareness of awareness, is not something we attribute to ordinary physical systems. And this distinction might provide a clue as to why consciousness seems to have such a unique role in quantum theory. At the same time, the notion that consciousness is linked to quantum mechanics also gains support from a completely different source: the limitations of classical computation. One of the key figures in connecting these ideas is Roger Penrose, a British mathematical physicist whose work covers general relativity, cosmology, and quantum gravity. Penrose is most famous for his collaborations with Stephen Hawking on black holes and space-time singularities, but in the late 20th century he shifted his focus to consciousness. Penrose did not start with quantum mechanics. Instead, he began with mathematics. In his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, Penrose argued that human consciousness, particularly our ability to understand mathematical truth, cannot be explained by classical computation. He referred to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which demonstrate that in any formal mathematical system there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. Penrose noted that human mathematicians can recognize the truth of such statements even when they are formally unprovable. He concluded that the human mind must be doing something that transcends algorithmic computation. In other words, the brain cannot be a mere computer. But if consciousness is not computational, then what is it? Penrose proposed that the solution might lie in quantum mechanics, but not the standard version taught in textbooks. He believed that an entirely new type of quantum process, one that bridges the gap between the quantum and classical worlds, might be responsible for conscious experience. This idea led him to formulate the concept of objective reduction, or OR. In this framework, quantum superpositions do not need an observer to collapse. Instead, they collapse on their own due to gravitational effects. When the difference in space-time curvature between the components of a superposition reaches a certain limit, nature selects one outcome over the others. This collapse is not caused by measurement, but by an objective physical threshold, hence the term objective reduction. But this was only the first part of Penrose's proposal. The second part emerged when he teamed up with Stuart Hameroff, an American anesthesiologist with a background in consciousness and brain biology. Together, Penrose and Hameroff created a unified theory, orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR. They suggested that quantum superpositions occur not just in subatomic particles, but inside the brain itself, specifically within structures called microtubules. These tiny protein assemblies found in neurons are involved in maintaining cell shape and supporting intracellular transport. But Hameroff believed they had a deeper potential. In the ORC-OR model, microtubules support coherent quantum states that evolve and collapse according to Penrose's OR mechanism. These collapses are not random. They are orchestrated by the brain's biological processes and give rise to moments of conscious awareness. In this view, consciousness is not merely the result of neural computation, but of orchestrated quantum events happening deep within the brain. The proposal is radical. It challenges the computational theory of mind. It challenges the view of consciousness as emergent, and it reintroduces the observer into quantum physics, not as a problem, but as a fundamental part of nature. Critics have raised valid objections. Quantum states are notoriously fragile, and the brain is a warm, wet, and noisy environment, not the kind where delicate quantum phenomena are expected to survive. We will explore those criticisms in detail later. But at this point in our journey, what is important is that the link between consciousness and quantum mechanics had become more than speculation. It had evolved into a formal theory, complete with biological mechanisms, mathematical descriptions, and testable predictions. And at its core was a simple yet profound idea. Consciousness might be the key to resolving the measurement problem, not by stepping outside of physics, but by expanding physics to include processes that were previously overlooked. If this idea is even partially correct, then it changes how we understand both mind and matter. It suggests that the observer is not an afterthought in the story of the universe, but a central character, not a passive spectator, but an active participant in the unfolding of reality. To understand how the ORC-OR theory developed, we must first go back and look at its conceptual origins. Long before microtubules became part of the discussion, Roger Penrose was already questioning the prevailing assumptions about the mind and its connection to physical law. His inquiries did not start with biology, but with the limits of mathematics. And from there, his reasoning led him to propose one of the most unconventional interpretations of quantum collapse ever suggested. Penrose's main concern was not just how consciousness functions, but whether the known laws of physics and computation could even account for it in principle. He approached this issue from an unusual perspective: mathematical logic. In the 1930s, the Austrian logician Kurt Gödel had proven two famous theorems demonstrating that in any sufficiently powerful formal mathematical system, there are truths that cannot be proven within that system. These findings shook the foundations of mathematics and had profound philosophical implications. They suggested that no matter how comprehensive a set of formal rules might be, there would always be truths that lie beyond them. Penrose believed that this result had something significant to say about the human mind. He argued that human mathematicians can perceive the truth of certain Gödel-type statements even when those truths cannot be derived by any formal system. In other words, the mind seems capable of recognizing truths that no algorithm can generate. If the mind were merely a computer executing deterministic algorithms, this should not be possible. This led Penrose to a bold conclusion: the brain must be doing something non-computational. It cannot be explained by classical physics alone, nor by any kind of algorithmic processing, regardless of its complexity. But where could non-computational processes originate? Penrose turned to the one area of physics that had not yet been fully understood: quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is the theoretical framework that aims to unite general relativity, which governs gravity and the structure of spacetime, with quantum mechanics, which governs particles and forces at the smallest scales. Despite decades of work, a complete and experimentally verified theory of quantum gravity does not yet exist. Penrose, however, believed that consciousness might offer a window into this uncharted territory. In his view, the collapse of the quantum wave function is not just a mathematical convenience or the result of measurement. Instead, it is a real physical process caused by an instability in space-time geometry. When a quantum system exists in a superposition of different states, each state corresponds to a slightly different curvature of spacetime. If the separation between these curvatures exceeds a certain threshold, the superposition becomes unstable and collapses into a definite outcome. Penrose termed this process objective reduction, or OR. It is objective because it does not rely on an observer or measurement. It is a built-in feature of the universe. And it is a reduction because it reduces a superposed quantum state into a single definite state. According to Penrose, this process of collapse is neither entirely random nor entirely deterministic. It is influenced by factors within the quantum system, but it is not triggered by external measurement. It happens spontaneously when the gravitational differences between components of the superposition reach a critical level. The idea was revolutionary. It suggested that wave function collapse is not just a matter of epistemology, of what we know, but a real ontological event, something that occurs in the physical world regardless of observation. But more importantly, Penrose believed that this objective reduction process might be the missing piece in understanding consciousness. In classical neuroscience and in artificial intelligence models, consciousness is viewed as emerging from the organization and activity of large-scale neural networks. But these models are fundamentally computational. Penrose argued that if consciousness is rooted in non-computational processes, then it must originate in a place where quantum effects, especially non-computable ones, could play a role. That line of reasoning led him to the brain. But instead of focusing on neurons and synapses, which had been extensively studied, Penrose wondered if there might be finer structures within brain cells that could support quantum coherence. He suspected that the answer might lie not at the level of whole neurons, but at the subcellular scale, somewhere deeper, smaller, and perhaps more protected from the disruptive noise of biological processes. Around this time, Penrose connected with Stuart Hameroff, a practicing anesthesiologist and researcher interested in the biological basis of consciousness. Hameroff had long believed that conventional neuroscience overlooked the importance of the cell's internal architecture, particularly the cytoskeleton. Among the components of the cytoskeleton, one structure stood out: microtubules. Microtubules are cylindrical polymers made of tubulin proteins. They form part of the scaffolding inside cells and are involved in a range of essential functions, from maintaining cell shape to facilitating transport within the cell. In neurons, microtubules extend along axons and dendrites, helping to organize signaling pathways. But Hameroff believed they might be doing something more. Microtubules have a highly ordered lattice structure. The repeating patterns of tubulin dimers create a regular quasi-crystalline environment that some theorists believe could support quantum coherence under the right conditions. Hameroff suggested that tubulin subunits could exist in quantum superpositions, and that these superpositions could be orchestrated coherently, synchronized across networks of microtubules within neurons. This idea aligned perfectly with Penrose's objective reduction theory. If coherent quantum states could form within microtubules, then objective reductions might occur spontaneously within the brain, and these events, Penrose and Hameroff proposed, could correspond to discrete moments of conscious awareness. Thus was born the OR theory, orchestrated objective reduction. According to this theory, consciousness is not the result of computation or neural signaling alone. Instead, it arises from orchestrated patterns of quantum collapse occurring in the structured environment of neuronal microtubules. Each collapse represents a moment of awareness, and the brain's biological systems serve to regulate and synchronize these collapses in ways that correspond to our thoughts, perceptions, and experiences. The theory is radical in every sense. It posits that consciousness is not only quantum in nature, but that it originates from quantum gravitational processes that have not yet been observed directly. It shifts the locus of consciousness from neural networks to subcellular structures. And it bridges one of the biggest gaps in modern science by linking the hard problem of consciousness to one of the most mysterious areas of physics, the unification of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Critics have pointed out that the theory depends on quantum coherence in biological systems, something that was once thought impossible due to the decoherence effects of thermal noise. Yet, even as these criticisms were raised, evidence was emerging that quantum coherence does exist in certain biological systems, including photosynthesis and avian navigation. For Penrose and Hameroff, these findings strengthened the plausibility of their proposal. While the full OR model remains controversial, it has inspired new avenues of research at the intersection of physics, biology, and consciousness studies. At the core of Penrose's thinking lies a powerful idea: that consciousness is not an illusion, not a mere byproduct of complexity, but a window into the fundamental nature of reality. It may arise not from the structures we can see under a microscope, but from the hidden geometry of space-time itself. With the conceptual groundwork of objective reduction established and the intriguing possibility that microtubules might provide the biological setting for quantum events, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proceeded to formulate a comprehensive theory that sought to explain consciousness not as an emergent quality of neural computation, but as a direct outcome of orchestrated quantum processes in the brain. The product of their collaboration was OR, short for Orchestrated Objective Reduction. It was a daring fusion of physics, biology, and cognitive science, a theory that aimed to connect the subatomic realm with the most intimate aspect of human experience: awareness. At the core of OR is a specific proposition: quantum coherence, a delicate state where particles exist in multiple interdependent conditions, is thought to happen within the brain's microtubules. These microtubules are not minor components of neurons. They are essential parts of the cell's internal framework, creating cylindrical scaffolds that oversee a wide range of cellular activities. In neurons, they are particularly abundant and structurally organized, stretching throughout the axons and dendrites that form the brain's trillions of synaptic connections. Hameroff had been studying microtubules for years before he met Penrose. He was especially fascinated by their regular lattice structure, which is composed of repeating units of tubulin, a protein dimer that can exist in various conformational states. He theorized that these conformational states could function as quantum bits, or qubits, similar to those used in quantum computing. Qubits, unlike classical bits, can exist in superpositions, which allows for parallel processing on a massive scale. This idea was provocative because it suggested that the brain could perform quantum computations. But the OR theory went even further. It proposed that these quantum computations do not simply process information. Instead, they evolve toward a threshold set by Penrose's objective reduction mechanism. When the gravitational differences between competing quantum states surpass a critical limit, the superposition collapses, not randomly, but in a manner influenced by the underlying quantum information. This collapse is what Penrose and Hameroff identified as a moment of conscious awareness. According to OR, consciousness is not a continuous stream. It progresses in discrete events, brief pulses of awareness that occur many times per second. These events are orchestrated not just in their timing, but also in their content by the structure and dynamics of the microtubules and their interactions with the surrounding neural systems. In other words, consciousness emerges not from neurons firing in sequence, but from quantum computations occurring inside those neurons, synchronized and collapsed in a way that creates a coherent experience of now. This model sharply contrasts with the classical computational theory of mind. It does not depend solely on traditional algorithms or synaptic networks. Instead, it introduces a fundamentally different kind of information processing, one that is not only non-computational but is rooted in space-time geometry and quantum gravity. Critics have, quite reasonably, questioned the feasibility of this proposal. The most pressing concern is decoherence, the tendency for quantum states to collapse when they interact with their environment. The brain, being warm, wet, and filled with chaotic activity, seems like a hostile environment for fragile quantum states. In standard physics, maintaining quantum coherence in such a setting is considered almost impossible without extreme isolation and low temperatures. Penrose and Hameroff, however, pointed to emerging evidence that nature may have found ways to overcome these challenges. In particular, they highlighted research in quantum biology, a field that has shown coherent quantum processes in living systems once thought too thermally noisy for such behavior. For instance, studies in photosynthesis have demonstrated that energy transfer in certain plant and bacterial systems involves coherent quantum wave-like motion. This allows energy to find its most efficient path to the reaction center, a phenomenon that classical physics alone cannot explain. Similarly, research into avian magnetoreception suggests that birds use entangled electrons in proteins called cryptochromes to sense Earth's magnetic field during navigation. These findings have shifted the discussion. If delicate quantum processes can exist in biological systems, perhaps the brain is not as inhospitable to quantum coherence as once believed. Hameroff argued that the interior of microtubules might provide a shielded environment suitable for quantum states, especially if aided by quantum error correction mechanisms and ordered water structures lining the tubulin lattice. Furthermore, the theory proposed that quantum coherence in the brain does not need to last indefinitely. Even brief coherence on the order of milliseconds could be sufficient for orchestrated objective reduction to occur and generate conscious moments. One of the strengths of ORC-OR is that it makes testable predictions. Penrose and Hameroff suggested specific timings for conscious events based on the energy scale of gravitationally induced collapse. They also proposed that anesthesia, which disrupts consciousness, may act by interfering with microtubule dynamics, offering a potential way to experimentally validate the theory. Indeed, anesthetics are known to interact with the lipid environment of cell membranes, but Hameroff proposed that they also bind directly to tubulin, altering its quantum behavior. This idea would later inspire experimental investigations aimed at determining whether microtubules are involved in the onset and reversal of anesthesia. Despite these testable implications, the ORC-OR theory remains highly controversial. Most neuroscientists are still unconvinced that quantum processes play a functional role in cognition, and many quantum physicists question whether objective reduction is physically well-defined. The theory exists at the intersection of fields that often do not speak the same language, and this, in part, has made it difficult to evaluate on purely empirical grounds. Still, what cannot be ignored is that ORC-OR attempts to do something most other theories of consciousness do not. It confronts the hard problem directly. It does not reduce consciousness to computation or dismiss it as an illusion. Instead, it treats consciousness as an intrinsic, irreducible aspect of physical reality, one that emerges not from complexity alone, but from fundamental interactions at the quantum gravitational level. It also offers a potential answer to why consciousness feels unified. In classical neural networks, information is processed in parallel across many modules, but that does not explain why experience seems to coalesce into a single, seamless whole. In ORC-OR, the collapse of a coherent quantum state containing entangled information from across the brain could account for this unity. Moreover, OR suggests that consciousness is not just a property of biological systems, but a process that taps into the deep structure of the universe. This carries metaphysical implications, of course, but it also invites scientific exploration into the possibility that conscious experience is a fundamental component of nature, not unlike mass, charge, or spin. Whether or not OR is correct, its significance lies in the fact that it connects two of the most mysterious domains in science, consciousness and quantum mechanics. It proposes that the link between them is not incidental, but essential. To assess whether OR offers a plausible account of consciousness, we must take a closer look at the specific structures it places at the center of this quantum biological bridge. Microtubules. These tiny cylindrical scaffolds, once thought to serve only structural and transport roles inside the cell, have become central to a bold hypothesis that they are quantum computers operating deep within the architecture of the brain. Microtubules are composed of tubulin dimers, pairs of alpha and beta tubulin proteins that assemble into hollow tubes with a diameter of about 25 nanometers. Each tubulin dimer acts like a modular building block, and thousands of them line up to form long, hollow cylinders that span the internal spaces of the cell. Within neurons, microtubules are particularly well developed. They extend throughout axons and dendrites, guiding the growth and maintenance of the neuron's vast, branching network of connections. From a classical biological perspective, the importance of microtubules is undeniable. They are essential for cell division, intracellular transport, and maintaining the shape and polarity of neurons. They also play a critical role in the migration of developing neurons and in organizing the synaptic architecture that underpins learning and memory. But Stuart Hameroff, who had been studying microtubules as an anesthesiologist, saw something more. He proposed that tubulin proteins could switch between different states, somewhat like binary units, but with the added possibility of occupying quantum superpositions of those states. In this view, tubulin dimers are not merely structural units. They are quantum elements capable of storing and processing information across coherent quantum states. This is a bold claim, and it raises several important questions. First, what physical evidence suggests that microtubules are suitable for quantum computation? Second, how might these structures protect quantum coherence in a warm, noisy biological environment? And third, do microtubules show behavior that is qualitatively different from what we would expect if they were merely classical components? Let us begin with the structural basis. Microtubules are not random or amorphous. They exhibit a highly ordered helical lattice structure. This geometric regularity is thought to create a form of symmetry that could help shield quantum states from decoherence. In particular, the hydrophobic pockets within tubulin proteins, regions that repel water, could create quantum-friendly zones where the influence of thermal noise is reduced. These pockets might allow for coherent dipole oscillations, a key ingredient in sustaining quantum entanglement. Furthermore, the interior of microtubules is filled with structured water, a form of water whose molecules align in a more ordered pattern than typical bulk water. Some researchers believe that this structured water could help isolate quantum states, supporting coherence through a kind of quantum shielding. While this remains a matter of ongoing investigation, it introduces a possible mechanism by which biology might maintain quantum conditions longer than previously thought possible. The second important consideration is functionality. If microtubules truly support quantum coherence, we would expect them to demonstrate some form of organized behavior that exceeds the predictions of classical biology. Indeed, some studies have suggested that microtubules exhibit properties consistent with electrical oscillations and signal propagation, not just mechanical support. In the early 2000s, Japanese physicist Masashi Jibu and his collaborators proposed models in which quantum vibrations in microtubules could propagate through networks of neurons. These vibrations might create coherent wave patterns that synchronize across regions of the brain, perhaps even coordinating the orchestration required in OR. Subsequent work by Indian physicist Anirban Bandyopadhyay added experimental weight to these ideas. In a series of studies beginning in the mid-2000s, Bandyopadhyay's team used sophisticated nanoscale probing techniques to measure oscillatory activity in isolated microtubules. What they found surprised many. Microtubules exhibited resonant frequencies in the megahertz to gigahertz range, far faster than traditional neural activity. These ultra-fast vibrations, if verified and replicated, might provide a physical substrate for quantum processing. They could allow for rapid information integration within a single neuron and potentially across networks of neurons. According to ORC-OR, it is this integration, coordinated across space and time and governed by Penrose's objective reduction, that gives rise to conscious moments. But the leap from observed vibrations to consciousness is a large one. Not everyone in the scientific community agrees that the evidence supports the claims made by Hameroff and Penrose. Critics argue that while microtubules may play electrical or regulatory roles in neurons, these behaviors do not require quantum mechanics to explain. Others suggest that observed resonances could be artifacts of measurement or that coherence, even if present, might not be sustained long enough to contribute meaningfully to cognition. Still, there are reasons not to dismiss the possibility. As mentioned previously, nature has found ways to exploit quantum phenomena in environments that are not traditionally considered quantum-friendly. In the process of photosynthesis, for example, certain protein complexes guide energy transfer with near-perfect efficiency, an effect best explained through quantum coherence. If plants can maintain such precision, is it unreasonable to think that evolution might have developed similar mechanisms in animals, particularly in an organ as complex and energy-hungry as the brain? Moreover, there are functional reasons for the brain to evolve such a capability. The human brain operates with remarkable efficiency, using only about 20 watts of power to perform tasks that remain out of reach for even the most advanced computers. Quantum processing, if it exists in the brain, could offer a level of parallelism and integration that classical computation cannot match. From this perspective, microtubules may not just be passive structural supports or transport tracks. They may be deeply involved in the timing, coherence, and perhaps even the generation of subjective experience. Supporting this view, researchers have found that microtubules are not evenly distributed throughout the neuron, but are especially concentrated in areas near synapses, where they may influence the strength and timing of neural firing. Some studies suggest that microtubules can modulate synaptic activity through calcium signaling and protein trafficking, functions closely tied to memory and learning. If microtubules indeed play a dynamic role in synaptic regulation, and if they are capable of supporting quantum coherence, then the line between classical and quantum processing in the brain may not be so clear. It is conceivable that classical signals, such as electrical impulses along axons, could be shaped or even initiated by quantum events happening at the subcellular level. The implications are profound. They suggest a nested model of brain function with classical neural networks on the surface and quantum processes occurring in the depths. Consciousness in this model is not simply the output of neurons, but the product of a deeper layer of reality, a layer governed by the strange, beautiful laws of quantum physics. Of course, this is still a theory in development. The evidence, while suggestive, remains incomplete. The experimental challenges are immense. Measuring quantum states inside living cells is extraordinarily difficult, and isolating the role of microtubules in consciousness is even more so. Yet the theory has sparked new lines of inquiry. It has drawn attention to structures once overlooked in neuroscience. It has encouraged collaboration between physicists, biologists, and consciousness researchers. And it has reminded the scientific community that some of the most basic questions, what is the mind and how does it arise, may require thinking far beyond conventional boundaries. If microtubules within neurons are truly capable of supporting quantum processes, it is worth asking whether such behavior is unique to the brain or whether it might be part of a broader biological principle. In recent decades, a surprising number of discoveries have emerged from the growing field of quantum biology, a discipline that explores how living organisms might be using the strange laws of quantum mechanics to carry out life's most fundamental tasks. For much of the 20th century, the idea that quantum mechanics could play a significant role in biology was viewed with skepticism. After all, quantum phenomena such as superposition, entanglement, and tunneling were believed to occur only in highly controlled environments, cryogenic temperatures, isolated vacuum chambers, or in the carefully tuned architecture of quantum computers. Biology, by contrast, is messy. It operates at body temperature in fluid environments, surrounded by constant molecular noise. Yet nature has repeatedly demonstrated a capacity for exploiting physical laws in surprising and efficient ways. And beginning in the early 2000s, scientists began to uncover evidence that certain biological systems not only tolerate quantum effects, but seem to rely on them. One of the first and most striking examples came from the study of photosynthesis. In photosynthetic organisms such as plants, algae, and certain bacteria, sunlight is captured by pigment protein complexes and converted into chemical energy. The process begins when a photon of light excites an electron, creating an energy packet known as an exciton. This exciton must then travel through a network of molecules to reach the reaction center, where the energy is stored in chemical bonds. Classical physics would suggest that the exciton should take a random walk, bouncing from molecule to molecule until it eventually reaches its destination. But this kind of diffusive transport is inefficient and slow. Yet experiments showed that energy transfer in these systems is astonishingly fast and efficient, nearly 100% in some cases. In 2007, a research team led by physicists Graham Fleming and Greg Engel used a technique called two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy to observe energy flow within the Fenner-Matthews-Olson complex, a photosynthetic protein found in green sulfur bacteria. What they discovered stunned the scientific community. The excitons appeared to explore all possible paths simultaneously, as though the system were using quantum superposition to sample multiple routes at once. This allowed the energy to find the most efficient path, not by trial and error, but by a kind of quantum optimization. This discovery demonstrated that quantum coherence, the simultaneous existence of multiple states, could persist in a warm, wet biological system for surprisingly long durations, on the order of hundreds of femtoseconds. While brief, these timescales are more than sufficient for molecular processes like energy transfer. It was the first clear indication that quantum mechanics could play a functional role in biology. Following this breakthrough, researchers began to look for quantum effects in other systems. One of the most compelling candidates was avian magnetoreception, the ability of migratory birds to navigate using Earth's magnetic field. For decades, scientists puzzled over how birds could detect such weak magnetic fields with such precision. One hypothesis involved magnetite crystals in their beaks, but this did not fully explain the sensitivity or consistency of their navigation. An alternative hypothesis, developed in the late 20th century and supported by growing evidence, centers on cryptochromes, light-sensitive proteins found in the eyes of birds and many other animals. These proteins are thought to generate pairs of entangled electrons when exposed to blue light. The spins of these electrons are influenced by Earth's magnetic field, and the resulting chemical changes provide directional information to the bird. This process would require the entangled electron pair to remain coherent long enough to influence the chemical outcome, an extraordinary claim given the thermal noise inside a living cell. Yet experiments have supported the idea. In 2021, a team led by Thorsten Ritz and colleagues provided direct evidence of magnetic sensitivity in cryptochromes, suggesting that quantum entanglement plays a key role in avian navigation. If confirmed, this would represent a second major instance in which life appears to depend on quantum coherence to perform a complex task, one involving sensory perception and behavior. Another fascinating area of research involves the sense of smell. Traditional theories of olfaction suggested that odorant molecules fit into receptors like keys into locks, with shape determining the match. But this explanation has trouble accounting for why molecules with nearly identical shapes can smell entirely different, and why different shapes can sometimes produce the same scent. A competing theory proposed by biophysicist Luca Turin suggests that smell may involve quantum tunneling. According to this idea, odorant molecules trigger receptor responses not by shape alone, but by allowing electrons to tunnel across a barrier within the receptor. This process depends on the vibrational frequency of the molecule, meaning that smell may be more about vibration than geometry. Although its validity is still under discussion, empirical studies have provided provisional backing for this vibrational theory of olfaction. For instance, animals conditioned to differentiate between odorant molecules with comparable shapes but distinct vibrational spectra have demonstrated the capacity to tell them apart. This outcome is challenging to account for solely with the lock and key model. Collectively, these instances create a compelling pattern. In photosynthesis, magnetoreception, and potentially olfaction, quantum phenomena seem to deliver distinct benefits, such as enhanced efficiency, sensitivity, or discrimination. In every scenario, biological evolution appears to have exploited phenomena that, until recently, were thought to be confined to the realm of physics laboratories and quantum devices. This calls into question the presumption that quantum coherence is excessively delicate for biological systems. On the contrary, it implies that life may be exceptionally adapted for operating under quantum principles, and perhaps even optimized for them. How does this apply to the brain? It establishes a kind of precedent. If nature is capable of maintaining coherence in protein complexes related to light capture and navigation, then the notion of microtubules sustaining quantum states ceases to be inherently unfeasible. The brain, far from being a singular case, might be one more instance of biology leveraging quantum effects to execute functions that classical mechanisms are unable to fully clarify. Furthermore, the brain is an exceptionally taxing organ. It is metabolically demanding, utilizing a significant portion of the body's energy. It functions with great velocity and impressive parallel processing, and it produces a cohesive field of conscious experience from a decentralized network of cells. In principle, these difficulties could be addressed through quantum mechanisms. Coherence might assist in synchronizing far-flung areas of the brain. Entanglement could enable the immediate integration of information, and quantum collapse, as suggested in the ORCO model, could supply the mechanism through which dispersed neural activity converges into moments of consciousness. To be explicit, the existence of quantum effects in other biological systems does not establish that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, but it does, however, reinforce the hypothesis's credibility. It demonstrates that biology is capable of sustaining coherence, protecting quantum states, and leveraging the characteristics of quantum mechanics in ways that classical physics struggles to emulate. This accumulating body of evidence has spurred new initiatives to explore whether quantum phenomena are operational within the brain and if they are crucial for consciousness. It has also prompted researchers to create instruments and experimental setups capable of identifying and manipulating quantum states within living cells. We are merely in the initial stages of this investigation. The field is nascent, the measurements are challenging, and the theories are in a state of flux, but it is becoming progressively evident that life itself could be more quantum-based than we had ever conceived. While the accumulating evidence from quantum biology has created fresh avenues for comprehending consciousness, it has also fueled more intense debate. As compelling as theories such as ORCO might be, a large number of scientists hold a position of profound skepticism. They contend that such concepts are not only conjectural but also possibly superfluous, and that turning to quantum mechanics to account for consciousness might be akin to solving one enigma by creating another. To conduct a fair assessment of the quantum perspective, we must grasp the most significant objections it encounters. These critiques originate from a range of fields, including neuroscience, quantum physics, computer science, and philosophy. Each one disputes a unique facet of the quantum consciousness hypothesis, from its biological viability and mathematical consistency to its scientific necessity. One of the most persistent and powerful criticisms revolves around the problem of decoherence. As detailed in earlier sections, quantum states are famously fragile. In laboratory environments, preserving quantum coherence demands extraordinary precautions, such as cryogenic temperatures, vacuum isolation, and protection from even the most minor environmental disturbances. The brain's warm, clamorous, and active setting appears to be the antithesis of these requirements. Physicist Max Tegmark tackled this problem head-on in a paper released in the late 1990s. He calculated the decoherence timescales for quantum states within the brain, encompassing those that could potentially arise inside microtubules. His finding was unequivocal. In biological settings, decoherence would happen far too rapidly, on the scale of femtoseconds, for any substantial quantum processing to take place. In essence, the quantum states would collapse due to environmental interference long before they could be organized into the types of patterns stipulated by the ORC-O model. Tegmark's research is frequently referenced as a definitive refutation of quantum consciousness theories, implying that even if microtubules possess some unique characteristics, they are unable to maintain quantum coherence for a duration sufficient to be significant. Penrose and Hameroff countered by questioning Tegmark's premises. They asserted that his model failed to consider the real structure and environment of microtubules, which includes the potential for shielding by ordered water and internal symmetries that might impede decoherence. They also raised the question of whether quantum error correction, a method by which coherent states are preserved through self-stabilizing patterns, could be functional in biological systems. Nevertheless, the issue of decoherence continues to be an open question. In the absence of empirical proof that quantum coherence can persist long enough within the brain, any theory reliant on such coherence stays in the realm of speculation. Another significant critique centers on the absence of direct proof. Although ORCO is rich in theoretical detail and is based on actual biological structures, no experiment has yet definitively shown that consciousness is a product of quantum processes. The existence of microtubules in neurons, even if they display electrical or vibrational characteristics, does not confirm their involvement in quantum computation. It also fails to connect those processes with the subjective experience of being aware. In the field of neuroscience, advancements have occurred without relying on quantum mechanics. Scientists have identified activity patterns linked to perception, intention, memory, and emotion. Research in brain imaging and neurophysiology has uncovered consistent neural correlates of consciousness. While these findings do not resolve the hard problem, they do lend credence to a model where consciousness is associated with large-scale neural dynamics rather than subatomic phenomena. From this viewpoint, quantum theories might be considered superfluous. They add a layer of complexity without providing clearer predictions or explanations. Philosopher Daniel Dennett, for example, has contended that incorporating quantum mechanics into theories of the mind is a form of magical thinking, serving as a placeholder for deficiencies in our current knowledge. He maintains that consciousness, despite its perplexing nature, must eventually be explained through evolutionary biology and computational neuroscience. Additional critics emerge from the field of quantum physics itself. A great number of physicists contest the notion that quantum mechanics necessitates a conscious observer. In line with interpretations like decoherence theory and many worlds, wave function collapse is seen as either an illusion rather than a reality, or as entirely superfluous. These perspectives hold that measurement does not call for an observer in the conventional meaning, and certainly not a conscious one. Within these models, quantum systems engage with their surroundings in a manner that effectively does away with superposition without needing to bring awareness into the picture. As soon as a system becomes entangled with innumerable other degrees of freedom, such as air molecules, light photons, or vibrations in the surrounding environment, it undergoes rapid decoherence. The outcome resembles classical behavior, even though the fundamental process is still quantum. Advocates of these interpretations contend that quantum mechanics should not be employed to account for consciousness because quantum theory itself does not hinge on consciousness. From this standpoint, ORC-O inverts the explanatory direction, employing one enigma to explain another without solving either. Critics also emphasize the challenge of falsification. For a theory to be considered scientific, it must offer testable predictions that could, in theory, be disproven. Many assert that ORO has not yet fulfilled this criterion. While it offers some predictions related to timing and proposes mechanisms that are testable, these experiments have not yet produced conclusive outcomes. Until it can be definitively separated from rival models through empirical methods, it will stay a hypothesis lacking experimental validation. Skeptics further note that classical models of consciousness are continuing to make progress. For example, global workspace theory, integrated information theory, and various other frameworks have spurred productive research and have made predictions that are consistent with observed brain dynamics. These models propose explanations for how consciousness might emerge from the interplay of extensive neural networks without resorting to quantum mechanics. Additionally, contemporary artificial intelligence systems, while not conscious in a human-like sense, have accomplished extraordinary things using purely classical computation. Language models, image recognition systems, and decision-making algorithms all function without the aid of quantum coherence. If consciousness necessitates quantum processes, why are these classical systems so adept at emulating aspects of cognition? Naturally, ORCO does not assert that classical processes are insignificant. It posits that quantum phenomena work in conjunction with classical neural activity. However, to many, this dual-level explanation tends to muddle the picture rather than illuminate it. There is also the matter of philosophical overextension. Certain interpretations of quantum consciousness theory lean towards metaphysics, proposing that consciousness is an intrinsic attribute of the universe. While this concept, which is related to panpsychism, has historical origins and contemporary proponents, it is not readily testable. Critics are concerned that such speculation obscures the distinction between science and philosophy and could impede progress by diverting attention from quantifiable phenomena. However, it would be hasty to entirely reject quantum consciousness theories. The history of science is replete with concepts that initially appeared improbable but gained acceptance as technology and data improved. Plate tectonics, heliocentrism, and quantum theory itself were all at one time viewed as fringe ideas. The fact that ORO has not been proven does not equate to it being incorrect, but it does require that it be subjected to rigorous standards of examination and evidence. And there are indications of advancement. Experimental methods are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Progress in nanotechnology, cryo-electron microscopy, and biophysics might eventually enable scientists to identify quantum coherence in real time within living cells. There are ongoing efforts to examine how anesthetics engage with microtubules, a research direction that could clarify whether consciousness and microtubular activity have a significant connection. In this respect, the criticism itself proves beneficial. It compels theories like ORCO to make their assumptions clearer, to hone their predictions, and to suggest new experiments. It ensures the discussion remains rooted in the scientific method, even as it ventures to the limits of current knowledge. And that might be the most crucial takeaway. The study of consciousness is not a settled discipline. It is a frontier teeming with enigma and potential. The controversies surrounding quantum models are a component of a larger effort to comprehend how subjective experience emerges within a physical reality. While quantum consciousness theories such as ORC aim to establish a foundation for awareness in the physics of spacetime and the dynamics of quantum systems, there exist alternative frameworks that follow a distinctly different path. These are models that dismiss the necessity of quantum mechanics entirely, seeking instead for solutions within the structure and dynamics of information itself. Among the most well-known and systematically developed of these is integrated information theory, commonly abbreviated as IIT. Integrated information theory does not start with neurons, microtubules, or quantum fields. Its starting point is a question: what sort of system possesses conscious experience, and how might we quantify the extent and nature of that experience? In essence, rather than attempting to explain consciousness by breaking it down into physical mechanisms, IIT endeavors to reverse engineer the phenomenon, beginning with the nature of consciousness and working backwards to deduce the types of systems that could produce it. This methodology is founded on several core observations. Firstly, conscious experience is unified. When one observes a red apple, one does not sense its color, form, and position as distinct sensations. They are perceived as a single, integrated whole. Secondly, consciousness is informative. Every moment of awareness rules out innumerable other potential experiences, thereby representing a particular state among a multitude of alternatives. These two characteristics, integration and information, constitute the foundation of IIT. The theory was first proposed by the Italian neuroscientist Giulio Tononi in the early 2000s. Tononi suggested that any system capable of producing consciousness must have a certain amount of EF, PHI, a mathematical value that signifies the extent to which the system integrates information. The greater the value of phi, the more conscious the system is considered to be. Phi is not simply a metric of complexity or interconnectedness. It signifies the degree to which the system cannot be reduced to its individual components. For instance, a digital camera may have millions of light sensors, but if every pixel functions on its own, the system as an entity does not integrate information. It handles it in parallel, but not as a cohesive unit. As per IIT, such a system would lack consciousness, regardless of the number of its components. In contrast, the human brain integrates information across various levels and time frames. Neural signals are not just processed in local areas, but are also distributed across extensive networks. Activity patterns in one area both affect and are affected by activity in other areas. This bidirectional exchange results in a system where the entirety is greater than the sum of its parts, a crucial condition for high psi. One of the advantages of IIT is that it presents a structured framework for quantifying consciousness. It lays out mathematical methods to ascertain the level of integration within a system. Although the precise calculation of phi for intricate systems like the human brain is still a significant computational hurdle. Nonetheless, researchers have employed approximations of phi to examine consciousness in different situations, such as sleep, anesthesia, and brain trauma. For instance, research utilizing transcranial magnetic stimulation paired with EEG recordings has demonstrated that when the brain is conscious, stimulation leads to complex, prolonged responses across various regions, which is a sign of high integration. During general anesthesia or in deep sleep, these responses become more straightforward and confined, suggesting reduced levels of integrated information. This link between phi-like metrics and states of consciousness provides backing for the theory. IIT also tackles the hard problem of consciousness, which is the question of why and how subjective experience comes into being. Tononi's response is both audacious and refined. Consciousness is how integrated information is perceived from within. From this perspective, consciousness is not a byproduct that arises from physical processes. It is synonymous with the causal framework of a system that integrates information in a particular manner. This leads to a remarkable inference. Consciousness is an inherent characteristic of certain types of systems. It is not limited to humans or even to living organisms. Any system with adequate integration could possess some degree of experience, no matter how basic or strange it might be. This assertion carries both philosophical allure and scientific consequences. It suggests that consciousness is not a binary state, but a graded one, existing in various degrees along a continuum. A dog might possess more consciousness than a lizard more than a bee, and a bee more than a thermostat. Even inside the human brain, various regions might contribute to consciousness to different extents based on their level of integration with the rest of the system. However, IIT does not claim that all things are conscious. A stone, for example, may be composed of many parts, but if these parts do not engage in a structured, integrated fashion, the system has no phi, and thus no experience. The critical factor is not complexity in itself, but the causal connections between the components. This framework also paves the way for assessing consciousness in artificial systems. Should a computer or robot be engineered in a manner where its internal design facilitates a high degree of information integration, IIT would suggest that it has some type of consciousness. The theory, therefore, offers a potential method for testing machine awareness, one that relies on internal structure rather than on behavior. Concurrently, this brings up ethical and philosophical dilemmas. If a system with high phi possesses conscious experience, could some of today's machines, which are highly interconnected information processing devices, have a rudimentary form of consciousness? What about neural networks that are trained to identify images or produce language? Even if their actions appear intelligent, does their design support the type of integration that IIT mandates? This line of questioning underscores both the potential and the contentious nature of the theory. IIT has also faced criticism from multiple perspectives. A significant issue is its practicality. The calculation of phi for systems in the real world is exceptionally challenging. The quantity of interactions in even a small network of components increases exponentially, which makes the precise measurement of integration computationally unfeasible for more than a few elements. Consequently, a large portion of the empirical research depends on simplified or estimated metrics. Another point of criticism relates to its falsifiability. While IIT offers definite predictions regarding the circumstances in which consciousness should or should not exist, some contend that these predictions are either too theoretical or too challenging to verify with the technology currently available. For example, how can we confirm assertions about consciousness in a system that we cannot question subjectively? Some neuroscientists also raise doubts about whether the theory is consistent with our knowledge of the brain. Although IIT pinpoints integration as a crucial aspect of consciousness, integration also happens in systems that are not conscious, like intricate control systems or artificial neural networks. Critics question whether the existence of integration is enough for consciousness, or if it is just a necessary condition. Others contest the theory's ontological assertions. IIT suggests that consciousness is an inherent characteristic of certain physical systems, a perspective that some equate with panpsychism, the notion that consciousness is a fundamental quality of the universe. While IIT doesn't extend that far, it does propose that consciousness is not confined to biological systems and that it stems from causal structure rather than from particular materials. In this regard, IIT presents a significant deviation from both traditional neuroscience and quantum models. It does not rely on unconventional physics or subcellular mechanisms. It does not necessitate wave function collapse or gravitational thresholds. Instead, it posits that consciousness is a result of information and its integration, theoretically quantifiable and rooted in causality. In spite of the hurdles, IIT has been the catalyst for a substantial amount of research and experimentation. It has shaped conversations about the essence of awareness, the design of artificial intelligence, and the ethical considerations of sentient machines. It has also played a part in the wider initiative to connect subjective experience with objective science. In certain respects, IIT and quantum theories of consciousness stand at opposing ends of a conceptual range. One is rooted in physics, the other in information. One highlights the enigmatic and unresolved, while the other aims for lucidity through formal structure. Nevertheless, both strive to achieve the same goal, to elucidate how and why consciousness emerges in the cosmos. As the inquiry into consciousness advances, it is becoming more and more apparent that any credible theory must address the idea of computation, what it entails to process information, how systems represent and alter data, and whether such activities can lead to awareness. While integrated information theory places this question at the forefront, focusing on the structure of information and its integration, a separate but connected line of investigation explores whether consciousness might emerge from a unique form of computation, one that is fundamentally quantum in its nature. To delve into this concept, we must first grasp the difference between classical and quantum computation. Classical computers, which are the backbone of everything from smartphones to supercomputers, handle information in a binary format. Every bit in a classical system has a value of either 0 or 1. These bits are altered using logical gates that operate according to deterministic principles, and the result of any computation is solely dependent on the initial input and the operations carried out. In contrast, quantum computers utilize qubits, or quantum bits, that can be in a superposition of both 0 and 1 at the same time. When several qubits are entangled, their collective state cannot be described on an individual basis. This enables quantum systems to represent and process a massive amount of information in parallel, using phenomena like superposition and entanglement to execute computations that are inherently different from what classical machines are capable of. The conceptual groundwork for quantum computing was established in the second half of the 20th century by visionaries such as Richard Feynman, David Deutsch, and Peter Shor. Feynman, in particular, noted that some physical systems are so intricate that simulating them with a classical computer would be practically unfeasible. He suggested that quantum computers, which are machines that follow the same principles as the systems they are simulating, could carry out such tasks with greater efficiency. This concept sparked a new area of research, one that is still expanding today. Contemporary quantum computers, although in their early stages, have shown the capacity to address particular problems like factoring large numbers, simulating molecular interactions, or optimizing complex systems at a much faster rate than their classical equivalents. While large-scale, fault-tolerant quantum computers are still being developed, the theoretical consequences are already significant. But what is the connection to consciousness? The link starts with the query of whether the human brain could, in a way, be a quantum computer, or at least employ quantum computational principles. If this were the case, it could assist in explaining why the brain can achieve things that seem beyond the scope of classical computation, such as swift pattern recognition, intuitive insights, emotional complexity, creativity, and perhaps most importantly, the experience of subjective awareness. Advocates of this perspective contend that the brain's computational capacity cannot be entirely encompassed by classical models. Even the most advanced artificial neural networks, which are based on classical designs, have difficulty emulating the adaptability and depth of human cognition. Is it possible that the brain has access to more profound computational capabilities, those that are grounded in the principles of quantum mechanics? This notion has been thoroughly examined by scientists such as Seth Lloyd, a quantum physicist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who has characterized the universe itself as a type of quantum computer. From Lloyd's standpoint, every physical process, from the movement of planets to the activation of neurons, can be interpreted as a kind of computation. The universe is, moment by moment, computing its own development, utilizing the language of quantum interactions. If this holds true, then perhaps consciousness is not an outlier, but a resulting characteristic of specific quantum computations. It's possible that systems that attain a certain level of complexity, coherence, and integration become not just intelligent, but also self-aware. David Deutsch, another key figure in the field of quantum computing, has extended this line of reasoning. Deutsch posits that to comprehend the mind, one must comprehend the nature of knowledge, and that knowledge itself is the outcome of information processing systems that are capable of speculation, error correction, and explanation. By pushing the boundaries of what can be known and computed, quantum computers might offer a new paradigm for considering these systems. Nevertheless, to assert that the brain engages in quantum computation is different from demonstrating it. The difficulty is in pinpointing physical mechanisms within the brain that are capable of supporting such computation. As previously mentioned, one theory centers on microtubules and their possible function in maintaining coherent quantum states. However, alternative possibilities have also been explored, including interactions at the molecular level, quantum tunneling in ion channels, or entangled states within groups of neurons. These concepts are still speculative, but they bring up significant questions. What sets a quantum computation apart from a classical one, not just in a technical sense, but in terms of experience? Is it possible that the subjective quality of consciousness, the qualia that characterize each moment of awareness, can only stem from quantum processes? Some theorists posit that the solution may be found in the essence of quantum indeterminacy. In classical computation, each step is a deterministic consequence of the one before it. In quantum systems, on the other hand, results are dictated by probabilities until they are measured. This lack of determinism brings in a factor of potentiality, with multiple futures coexisting until one is realized. If consciousness is part of, or even defined by, this process of turning potential into reality, then it could be closely connected to quantum computation. It's possible that the conscious mind isn't just processing information, but is choosing from a range of possible futures, taking part in the realization of one outcome over others. This concept aligns with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics that highlight the observer's role. From these perspectives, measurement is not merely a passive act of data collection. It is a form of interaction that solidifies definite states. If the brain is conducting quantum computations, and if consciousness is in some way linked to those computations, then awareness might not just be a reflection of the world, it could be actively involved in its formation. There is also a more technical dimension to this area of investigation. In classical computation, errors can build up over time and require correction through redundancy and error-checking procedures. Quantum computation also contends with issues of noise and decoherence. However, it also presents new techniques for error correction that are based on entangled states and logical qubits. Some researchers have suggested that biological systems might use similar methods, employing the structural characteristics of proteins or neural networks to maintain coherence and counteract quantum noise. Although this is still a theoretical idea, the quest for biological quantum error correction is in progress. If such mechanisms are found to exist, they would lend significant support to the hypothesis that the brain utilizes quantum information processing, and possibly even that it has evolved to do so with efficiency. Of course, critics maintain a level of caution. They highlight that quantum computing is still in its nascent phase and that assertions regarding quantum computation in the brain are frequently based on analogy rather than concrete proof. They stress that exceptional claims demand exceptional evidence, and the responsibility still lies with researchers to show that such processes are genuine, functional, and have a causal relationship with consciousness. Despite this, the notion that consciousness could be grounded in quantum computation continues to fuel research across various fields. It signifies a convergence of physics, neuroscience, information theory, and philosophy, serving as a reminder that the mind may not be fully understood through the lens of a single discipline. The definitive test for this concept will be through experimentation. Can we pinpoint coherent quantum states within the brain? Can we identify patterns of entanglement or superposition that are linked to mental phenomena? Can we construct artificial systems that mimic these patterns? And if we can, will they display any form of awareness? Building upon the conceptual groundwork of quantum consciousness and the intriguing notion that the brain might engage in quantum computations, a logical question emerges. Is any of this verifiable? For a concept to transition from conjecture to scientific theory, it must produce testable hypotheses and be open to empirical scrutiny. Over the last 2 decades, a small yet resolute cohort of researchers has endeavored to do just that, applying experimental methods to one of the most significant questions in science. Verifying quantum processes in biology is in itself a daunting task. Verifying them within the brain, an organ of immense complexity, sensitivity, and dynamic functioning, is a challenge of an exponentially greater magnitude. Nevertheless, scientists are progressively creating techniques to identify quantum phenomena in biological settings, and some of the most encouraging experiments are starting to focus on the hypotheses advanced by theories like ORCO. The most direct route to examining quantum consciousness theories may be through the microtubule hypothesis put forth by Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose. As per ORCO, microtubules inside neurons can maintain quantum coherence, and the coordinated collapse of these quantum states results in distinct moments of conscious awareness. If this holds true, then microtubules ought to display behaviors that suggest quantum processing, and these behaviors should change in significant ways in relation to the state of consciousness. One of the initial significant experimental initiatives to examine this concept was spearheaded by Anirban Bandyopadhyay, a physicist and expert in nanotechnology whose research connects quantum mechanics, biology, and materials science. Starting in the early 2000s, Bandyopadhyay and his team began to use scanning tunneling microscopy and atomic force microscopy to look into the electrical characteristics of microtubules. Their research, carried out on both isolated microtubule samples and within living cells, uncovered oscillating electrical signals at frequencies significantly greater than those typically seen in neurons, spanning from kilohertz to megahertz and even into the gigahertz spectrum. These signals were found to be coherent, continuous, and seemingly arranged in a fractal-like structure. For many in the field, this was an unforeseen discovery. Traditional neuroscience had not anticipated such activity in microtubules. The results indicated that microtubules might act as subneuronal oscillators, functioning at speeds that far exceed the action potentials of neurons, and could potentially play a role in the synchronization necessary for conscious experience. Bandyopadhyay also presented findings of resonant coupling between microtubules, which suggests that microtubules are capable of synchronizing their oscillations with each other over distances. This type of long-distance coherence is a key feature of quantum systems. Although it is not a direct confirmation of quantum entanglement or superposition, it does lend weight to the idea that microtubules have more intricate dynamics than had been previously thought. However, these discoveries continue to be a subject of debate. Critics have raised questions about whether the oscillations that were observed are genuinely quantum in origin, or if they can be accounted for by classical processes, such as the movement of ions or changes in protein conformation. The difficulty, as is often the case, is in distinguishing quantum characteristics like entanglement, coherence durations, or non-local connections within the chaotic setting of living tissue. To build a stronger argument for quantum processes in the brain, researchers have started to employ a variety of interdisciplinary methods. New developments in quantum optoelectronics, ultrafast laser spectroscopy, and nanoelectronic sensors are currently being modified for use in biological studies. These technologies make it possible to identify weak, swift, and high-frequency signals that might otherwise go undetected with standard electrophysiological techniques. There are also ongoing initiatives to determine if external quantum phenomena can engage with biological systems in a manner that influences consciousness. For instance, one area of study is looking into whether subjecting neural tissue or microtubules to entangled photons or coherent electromagnetic fields can alter their activity. While these experiments are still in their preliminary stages, they signify an effort to connect theoretical concepts with empirical evidence. A particularly fascinating area of research is centered on anesthetics, which provide a unique chance to link alterations in consciousness with shifts in molecular activity. Anesthetics such as halothane, isoflurane, and propofol are recognized for their ability to reversibly inhibit consciousness. It has been traditionally believed that their molecular points of action are located in synaptic receptors or ion channels, but there is some indication that they might also attach directly to tubulin, the protein components that make up microtubules. Hameroff and other researchers have suggested that anesthetics work to suppress consciousness by disrupting quantum coherence within microtubules. If this is accurate, then examining how anesthetics influence the vibrational or electrical characteristics of microtubules could provide crucial new understanding. Recent research has started to investigate how anesthetics modify microtubule oscillations, but the findings are still in the early stages and need more validation. In conjunction with these biological studies, scientists are also creating in vitro models, which are simplified experimental setups that mimic certain aspects of brain microtubules under controlled circumstances. By isolating tubulin proteins or building artificial microtubule structures, researchers can analyze their properties without the interference of the entire brain's variables. These systems can be cooled to extremely low temperatures, protected from interference, or exposed to regulated quantum stimuli, which allows for more accurate measurements. However, the primary objective has not yet been reached: to prove that quantum coherence in microtubules is connected to and plays a causal role in the experience of consciousness. To accomplish this, researchers need to devise methods for monitoring brain states during shifts in consciousness, such as the process of falling asleep, waking up, being under anesthesia, or recovering from a coma, and to link these states with quantifiable alterations in the dynamics of microtubules. Certain research teams have started to employ EEG, MEG, and fMRI in combination with high-definition intracellular recordings to investigate whether particular brainwave patterns are associated with events at the quantum level. For example, if specific frequencies of neural oscillation are found to be connected with microtubule vibrations, this could lend credence to the ORC, or prediction that conscious moments happen in distinct quantized periods. Other scientists have suggested indirect methods of testing. For instance, if consciousness is dependent on quantum coherence, it might be vulnerable to quantum noise or agents that induce decoherence in ways that classical processing is not. Experiments that deliberately amplify environmental noise through variations in temperature, electromagnetic fields, or pharmacological means could aid in determining if quantum fragility has a measurable impact on consciousness. There is also a growing fascination with animal models. By contrasting the brain dynamics of species with different levels of behavioral sophistication, researchers can investigate whether quantum signatures are more evident in species that show evidence of self-awareness, the use of tools, or metacognition. This comparative method could be instrumental in pinpointing which biological characteristics are linked to quantum processing and which are not. Finally, the emergence of quantum technologies, which includes entangled sensors, quantum-enhanced microscopes, and biologically friendly qubit platforms, is providing new instruments for the study of quantum biology. These tools may, in the future, permit the direct observation of entangled states, coherent transitions, or gravitationally induced collapse within living organisms. It should be noted that none of these initiatives have, as of yet, delivered conclusive evidence for quantum consciousness. The discipline is still in its early stages, and the technical hurdles are immense. However, the very fact that these experiments are now being conceived and conducted signifies a notable change. What was once a question of pure theory is now a subject of verifiable science. More significantly, these endeavors underscore the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Quantum physicists, neuroscientists, biochemists, and engineers are starting to work together in ways that would have been improbable a generation ago. In concert, they are delving into the boundary between matter and mind, between the physical realm and the subjective world of experience. Regardless of whether quantum consciousness theories are eventually validated, the experiments themselves are poised to offer significant discoveries. They might reveal new characteristics of microtubules, new mechanisms of anesthesia, or new types of biological computation. In doing so, they may move us nearer to comprehending how the brain produces the enigma of consciousness. Among the numerous instruments scientists have employed to examine consciousness, few are as captivating and enlightening as anesthesia. The capacity to reliably and reversibly deactivate consciousness without inflicting harm on the brain offers a unique scientific prospect. It enables researchers to witness what transpires when awareness vanishes and then returns. In this manner, anesthesia transcends its role as a medical instrument to become a portal into the processes that uphold conscious experience. The query is straightforward, yet deep. What is the actual effect of general anesthesia on the brain that leads to the cessation of consciousness? And just as crucially, what occurs when consciousness is restored? These inquiries are not merely abstract. Grasping the exact workings of anesthesia is vital for medicine, particularly in the fields of surgery and intensive care. But they also allude to something more profound. If we can pinpoint the biological mechanisms that regulate conscious states, we might start to comprehend how consciousness itself is formed. For a significant portion of modern medical history, the ways in which anesthetics induced unconsciousness were only incompletely understood. Medical professionals were aware that substances like ether, chloroform, and subsequently halothane and propofol could make patients non-responsive. However, the specifics of how these agents influenced the brain were largely an enigma. One of the initial significant scientific advancements occurred in the 20th century, when it was found that anesthetics attached to membrane proteins, especially those engaged in synaptic transmission. A number of anesthetics augment the activity of GABA-A receptors, which suppress neuronal firing, resulting in a widespread decrease in brain activity. Others inhibit the function of excitatory receptors, such as NMDA receptors, which further diminishes the communication between neurons. These discoveries gave rise to the predominant theory: anesthetics interfere with consciousness by interrupting the regular transmission of information between different areas of the brain. In the absence of coordinated activity between the thalamus, cortex, and other higher-level brain regions, the brain's capacity to integrate information is lost, and consciousness diminishes. This theory is in good agreement with certain models of consciousness, like the global neuronal workspace theory, which highlights the importance of extensive connectivity for maintaining awareness. If anesthetics obstruct this connectivity, then conscious processing is unable to take place. However, in more recent times, new discoveries have cast doubt on this perspective, or at the very least, have added more complexity to it. Researchers have started to observe that anesthetic molecules might not only affect the synapse or membrane level, but could also engage with more fundamental components of the cell. This has led to a renewed focus on microtubules, the intracellular frameworks that the OR core theory suggests are the quantum foundation of consciousness. Stuart Hameroff, who is an anesthesiologist by profession, had long proposed that anesthetics function not just by interfering with synaptic signals, but also by attaching directly to tubulin, the protein that is the fundamental component of microtubules. In line with this theory, anesthetics hinder consciousness by disrupting the quantum coherence within these microtubules. If the core concept is accurate and quantum phenomena in microtubules lead to distinct moments of awareness, then meddling with these phenomena should stop consciousness from happening, even if classical neural signaling is still somewhat operational. This concept is currently being researched, but it has resulted in a number of hypotheses that can be tested. One such hypothesis is that various anesthetics ought to influence microtubules in particular, quantifiable ways. Another is that consciousness should not be restored until the dynamics of the microtubules are back to normal, even if the neural connections seem to be functioning as expected on a superficial level. To investigate this, scientists have employed a variety of methods, including imaging technologies, molecular modeling, and electrophysiology. Certain research has indicated that anesthetic molecules do indeed attach to hydrophobic areas within tubulin proteins. In principle, this could modify the protein's conformational states or impact its capacity to participate in coherent oscillations. There is also indication that anesthetics modify the electrical characteristics of microtubules, reducing their resonant frequencies. This lends weight to the notion that microtubules are not simply passive frameworks, but are active elements that react to chemical alterations in a manner that could influence consciousness. A particularly noteworthy area of research is the initiation and termination of anesthesia. When a patient becomes unconscious, the change is frequently sudden, but it is not invariably a symmetrical process. The act of waking from anesthesia may take a different neurophysiological route than the process of falling into it. Some scientists have likened this to a phase transition in physics, where a minor alteration in the input causes an abrupt change in the state. If consciousness is linked to a quantum phenomenon, such phase transitions might be indicative of fundamental changes in coherence or entanglement. Electroencephalogram (EEG) recordings made during anesthesia reveal characteristic patterns such as bursts of slow oscillations, intervals of suppression, and the subsequent revival of normal brain rhythms. These alterations are in line with a modified integration and communication among brain networks, but they could also be a sign of more profound changes within cells, like the loss and recovery of microtubule function. The idea that anesthesia impacts both the classical and quantum aspects of the brain has spurred the development of new types of experiments. Some laboratories are currently contrasting the impacts of various anesthetics, not just in relation to consciousness, but also in terms of microtubule resonance, oscillation patterns, and binding affinity. Others are investigating genetically altered tubulin to determine if modifications in its molecular structure influence sensitivity to anesthetics. Animal models have also been shown to be of great value. Research in mice and fruit flies has demonstrated that mutations in tubulin can change an organism's reaction to anesthesia. While this is not conclusive, it does point to a possible connection between the structure of microtubules and the regulation of conscious states. It is crucial to note that none of these discoveries definitively prove that quantum coherence in microtubules is the cause of consciousness, but they do provide a means to experimentally differentiate between various models. If classical theories suggest that anesthesia's effects are confined to the membrane or network level, and quantum theories propose effects at the subcellular or molecular level, then experiments that uncover interactions specific to microtubules could aid in settling the argument. Furthermore, this area of study could have practical applications in medicine. Gaining a better understanding of how various anesthetics engage with different cellular targets might result in the development of safer and more efficient methods of sedation. It could also enhance the care of patients in comas or vegetative states, where consciousness is modified but not entirely absent. Perhaps most significantly, anesthesia provides a regulated, replicable environment for the study of consciousness during its transitions. In contrast to sleep or trauma, which tend to be more inconsistent, general anesthesia permits the accurate manipulation of the brain state. This positions it as a perfect model system, not just for the validation of theories, but for delineating the boundary between conscious and unconscious brain activity. As the instruments of neuroscience continue to be refined, and as quantum biology makes experimental headway, the investigation of anesthesia may provide the most lucid insight yet into how consciousness comes into being, how it can be interrupted, and how it might be reinstated. Whether the solution is found in synaptic activity, subcellular frameworks, or quantum computation, anesthesia offers a unique look into the workings of awareness. And it brings up a more profound philosophical query. What is the significance of the fact that consciousness can be so easily switched off? If awareness is so finely balanced that a few molecules can eliminate it, does this point to a fragility or a kind of highly calibrated precision? And what is it that is actually being shut down when we lose consciousness? To delve deeper into this, we need to broaden our perspective beyond biology and neuroscience and examine the more profound philosophical consequences. If consciousness can be chemically suspended, and if its existence or non-existence is contingent on internal processes, whether classical or quantum, then what, if any, is the role of consciousness in the universe as a whole? If consciousness can be so finely turned on and off by anesthetic molecules, brain trauma, or the natural ebb and flow of neural activity, then we are faced with a fascinating enigma. What is consciousness precisely? And why should it emerge at all from configurations of matter? This question has not only driven theories in neuroscience and physics, but has also sparked philosophical discussions that go back for centuries. And more, some intellectuals are going back to one of the most ancient and thought-provoking concepts of all, that consciousness might not be a recently developed characteristic of intricate brains, but rather an intrinsic quality of the universe itself. This perspective is referred to as panpsychism. It suggests that a certain type of consciousness, no matter how basic, is inherent in all physical systems, not only in humans or animals, but in all matter. Panpsychism does not assert that electrons have thoughts or that rocks have dreams, but that the fundamental elements of the universe have proto-conscious attributes, basic components of experience that, when brought together and unified in the appropriate manner, lead to full-fledged awareness. For a long time, panpsychism was a concept on the fringes. In the era of mechanistic science, where physical systems were seen as operating under blind deterministic laws, there appeared to be no compelling reason to believe that consciousness was in any way connected to atoms or energy fields. Matter was seen as lifeless, consciousness was a rarity, and the two were regarded as being in completely different categories. However, this rigid separation led to difficulties, the most significant of which was the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience emerge from processes that are entirely objective? How can a configuration of neurons, regardless of its complexity, give rise to the sensation of pain, the perception of the color red, or the feeling of self? This gap in our understanding has stubbornly persisted, despite significant advancements in mapping the brain. Panpsychism presents a bold answer to the hard problem. Consciousness does not stem from matter because matter already holds the potential for consciousness. If the fundamental components of the universe possess both physical and experiential qualities, then consciousness does not need to be brought into existence. It simply needs to be organized in the correct way. A key contemporary supporter of this perspective is Galen Strawson, a British philosopher who contends that physicalism, the belief that everything is physical, does not necessitate the exclusion of consciousness from the essence of nature. In fact, Strawson proposes that to be a thoroughgoing physicalist, one must acknowledge that consciousness is a core aspect of the physical world. As he phrases it, experience is simply what matter does. Another notable figure is Philip Goff, who has written extensively on the topic in both scholarly and popular works. Goff posits that panpsychism is not just metaphysically sound, but also empirically viable. By situating consciousness at the foundational level of existence rather than at the pinnacle of an evolutionary process, it offers a structure for explaining how subjective experience can be present in a universe that is otherwise governed by impersonal principles. Goff also connects panpsychism with quantum mechanics, noting that quantum theory already questions our conventional understanding of matter. In the realm of quantum physics, particles are not like miniature billiard balls, but are instead probabilistic entities that can be in multiple states at once, have no definite location until they are measured, and show non-local connections. These are not the characteristics of classical objectivity. If matter is so peculiar, so interactive, then it might not be such a stretch to think that it holds something similar to experience. Indeed, quantum mechanics has for a long time been linked with the observer's role. As we have discussed before, the act of measurement in quantum theory seems to cause a system to transition from a superposition of possibilities to a single, definite state. Some theories propose that it is the observation itself that triggers this collapse. While the majority of physicists do not believe that human consciousness is required for measurement, the question of what exactly makes up an observer is still unanswered. This lack of clarity has prompted some theorists to suggest that consciousness and quantum reality are interconnected, not just through biological systems like the brain, but at a more fundamental level. The late physicist John Archibald Wheeler put forward the concept of the participatory universe, where observers are actively involved in the formation of physical reality. Wheeler proposed that the universe needs observation to be fully brought into existence, and that we, as conscious beings, are a component of the mechanism through which the cosmos brings itself into being. His well-known saying, "It from bit," encapsulates this idea that all things, particles, forces, fields, stem from acts of informational differentiation, from the response to yes or no questions. Some have taken this to imply that consciousness and information are deeply intertwined, and that what we perceive as reality is the accumulation of countless acts of observational engagement. If panpsychism holds true, then consciousness is not merely a consequence of evolution. It is the very means by which the universe comprehends itself. This viewpoint has profound consequences. It implies that the distinction between systems that are conscious and those that are not is not a matter of one having experience while the other does not, but rather that in the latter, consciousness is excessively fragmented, spread out, or insufficiently integrated to create awareness in a way that we would recognize. From this perspective, consciousness is seen as a continuum, not a binary state. A bacterium might have a faint spark of awareness, a basic sensitivity to its surroundings. A tree might possess a widespread, non-centralized kind of sentience. A human brain, with its extensive network of integrated systems, could produce a complex fabric of self-aware consciousness. Quantum physics might have a function in this continuum. If coherence, entanglement, or other non-classical phenomena are involved in integration, then quantum effects could enhance or structure the protoconscious elements of matter into organized awareness. This would create a seamless link between panpsychism and quantum theories of the mind. Some scientists, like Henry Stapp, have explicitly supported this convergence. Stapp, a theoretical physicist who collaborated closely with the founders of quantum mechanics, suggested that consciousness and quantum phenomena are profoundly interconnected, each affecting the other in a continuous cycle that molds both the observer and the observed. In this framework, consciousness is not just a passive observer of reality. It is an active contributor to the ongoing development of the universe. And if consciousness is integrated into the very fabric of matter, then even the most basic interactions contain a subtle hint of awareness. Of course, this perspective is not without its critics. They contend that panpsychism has the potential to explain both too much and too little simultaneously. If all things are conscious, the term itself loses its ability to explain. And if proto-consciousness is not something that can be measured, how can the theory be verified or disproven? Others express concern that panpsychism is getting too close to metaphysics, moving away from the empirical exactitude that is a hallmark of modern science. They assert that while the puzzle of consciousness is genuine, the solution must be found within the realms of biology and neuroscience, not by attributing consciousness to every atom and particle in the cosmos. However, proponents of panpsychism argue that its merit is in its conceptual soundness. Instead of trying to create experience from matter that is non-experiential, it regards consciousness as a fundamental quality, one that increases in intricacy but does not simply appear out of nowhere. And if the scientific discoveries of the 20th and 21st centuries have taught us anything, it is that reality often goes against our expectations. After all, quantum mechanics itself was once thought to be nonsensical. The concept that particles could be in several locations at the same time, or that the measurement of one particle could instantly influence another across great distances, was beyond the imagination of classical physicists. But nature, it appears, does not adhere to our preconceived notions. In this vein, panpsychism invites us to consider a different kind of universe, one where consciousness is not an outlier to the laws of physics, but a core component, integrated into the very structure of space, time, and matter. As panpsychism brings back the notion that consciousness could be a fundamental aspect of reality, it leads to an even more expansive and challenging query. Could our comprehension of consciousness influence the direction of physics itself? For many years, physics has made progress by discovering more profound laws, consolidating disparate forces, uncovering concealed symmetries, and broadening our understanding of the universe's framework. However, as we now face the unresolved conflicts between quantum mechanics and general relativity, some theorists posit that we might be overlooking a crucial element of the puzzle. That overlooked element, they propose, could be consciousness. This is not a frivolous or esoteric assertion. It stems from a profound acknowledgement of the current constraints in physics, constraints that have remained despite years of exceptional research. Quantum mechanics, despite its remarkable accuracy in predicting the behavior of particles, provides no insight into gravity. General relativity, which explains gravity as the warping of spacetime, ceases to be effective at the quantum level. In spite of many attempts, a comprehensive theory of quantum gravity, one that connects the extremely small with the extremely large, has remained out of reach. Some scientists now hold the view that resolving this enigma might necessitate a change in our way of thinking. Instead of viewing consciousness as a secondary effect of neural processes, or even worse, disregarding it completely, we might need to recognize that consciousness is a genuine and influential part of physical systems. To create a truly all-encompassing theory of the universe, the observer must be incorporated, not merely as a passive onlooker, but as an integral part of the structure of reality. One of the initial proponents of this concept was John Archibald Wheeler, the theoretical physicist who introduced the term black hole and made substantial contributions to both quantum theory and general relativity. In the later stages of his career, Wheeler started to suggest that the universe was inherently participatory, that reality is not entirely established until it is perceived. His well-known statement, "The universe does not exist out there, independent of us," summed up this challenging perspective. Wheeler's participatory anthropic principle implied that observers are not just random occurrences in the cosmos, but are essential for its existence in its current state. Although his ideas were theoretical, they were based on the principles of quantum mechanics and cosmology. If the laws of physics are structured in such a way that conscious observers are bound to emerge, and if observation is a factor in determining what is real, then consciousness might be an integral part of the very fabric of physical law. This line of thought has been extended by contemporary theorists who view consciousness as the link between information and physical form. In quantum mechanics, the significance of information is already a key element. A system state is not described by physical particles, but by a wave function, a mathematical construct that represents probabilities, possibilities, and correlations. This wave function collapses when observed, resulting in a specific outcome from a range of uncertainties. But what precisely is an observation? Is it merely any interaction that captures a result, or does it necessitate a conscious observer? Most mainstream theories tend to avoid directly involving the mind. However, the line between measurement and consciousness is still indistinct. Some researchers, including physicists who specialize in the fundamentals of quantum mechanics, have started to think that consciousness and information might be two aspects of the same thing, that the observer effect is not some strange anomaly to be dismissed, but a hint at something more profound, that subjective experience is intertwined with the way reality comes into being. A suggestion that follows this line of thought is observer-centric physics, which posits that any all-encompassing theory of the universe needs to be developed from the viewpoint of an observer, not from a detached, all-seeing perspective, but from a viewpoint within the system itself. This change in perspective is consistent with relativity, where the laws of physics are described in relation to a specific frame of reference. It also connects with quantum mechanics, where different observers might describe the same system in various ways, depending on what they measure and when they measure it. This concept is apparent in advanced research on the holographic principle, black hole entropy, and the ADS-CFT correspondence, all of which give great importance to the movement and organization of information. In these theories, space and time themselves might be seen as emerging from patterns of entanglement, non-local connections between quantum bits of information. If consciousness is also a result of informational integration, then it might not just be a characteristic of minds, but a glimpse into the informational framework of space-time itself. This notion receives additional backing from the work of physicist Carlo Rovelli on relational quantum mechanics, which posits that physical attributes are not absolute, but exist only in relation to other systems. From this perspective, reality is seen as a network of connections, not as a group of separate entities. Measurement is not about uncovering facts that already exist, but about forming these connections. Consciousness, being a profoundly relational phenomenon, could be a key element in this network. Concurrently, physicists engaged in loop quantum gravity and string theory are still investigating the possible structure of quantum spacetime. These endeavors frequently concentrate on mathematical consistency and the ability to make predictions. However, as the mathematical formulas become more complex, some researchers are concerned that we are overlooking a vital component, something that cannot be readily expressed in equations alone. This apprehension has sparked a renewed fascination with phenomenology, the philosophical examination of experience in itself. If consciousness is not entirely captured by objective descriptions, then it may be an indicator of a level of reality that is subjective yet real, and which needs to be incorporated into the physics of the future. The consequences are immense. If consciousness is a fundamental aspect, then our current standard model of physics is not complete. We cannot fully comprehend particles, fields, or forces without also comprehending awareness. This would signify a major shift from centuries of scientific practice, which has always regarded the subjective as less important than the objective. And yet, this change might be essential. Every major scientific advancement, from Copernicus to Newton, from Einstein to Bohr, has necessitated a shift in our way of thinking. It's possible that the next major breakthrough will entail looking inward and acknowledging that the mind is not merely a consequence of the universe, but also a vital element in understanding it. This is not to say that physics should forsake its mathematical precision. Instead, it needs to broaden its horizons as researchers start to investigate the nature of consciousness through experiments, studying anesthesia, neural dynamics, quantum biology, and even artificial intelligence. They are collecting information that could one day contribute to the development of new physical laws. Some theorists, like Donald Hoffman, have gone as far as to suggest that space and time are not fundamental realities at all, but are instead emergent properties of conscious perception. In this radical viewpoint, consciousness is the primary reality, and the physical world is a kind of user interface, a means for minds to engage with each other without being swamped by the sheer complexity of reality. While these concepts are highly speculative, they all share a common element: that consciousness might be crucial to the most profound questions about our existence. Whether it's as a source of information, a decider of outcomes, or a contributor to the cosmic process, the mind could be as fundamental to the universe as energy or mass. What are the implications of this for the future of physics? It implies that any endeavor to merge quantum mechanics and general relativity may have to incorporate a theory of consciousness. It suggests that the theory of everything might not be finished until it clarifies not just the behavior of matter, but also the reason for the existence of experience. It means that physics, which has long been focused on what is measurable, must now also address the enigma of the one who is doing the measuring. This is not a dismissal of science, it is a progression of it. In the same way that classical mechanics was superseded by relativity and quantum theory, the current scientific models may also need to evolve to include the study of consciousness as a physical phenomenon, one that is not only rooted in biology, but also in the fundamental logic of the cosmos. Having traced the concept of consciousness through the domains of neuroscience, quantum mechanics, biology, and philosophy, we now find ourselves on the precipice of knowledge where empirical data, theoretical constructs, and a sense of wonder meet. The primary question that has led us, is consciousness a quantum mystery, is still unanswered, yet it has become much more complex. We started with an enigma, and we conclude not with a clear-cut solution, but with a more profound understanding of its intricacy and importance. Consciousness, as we have observed, is distinct from any other phenomenon in the scientific world. It is not simply another biological process like digestion or breathing. It is the very framework within which all scientific investigation is conducted. We don't just examine consciousness, we examine through it. Every observation, every experiment, every thought comes into being within the realm of subjective experience. This makes consciousness both the most commonplace and the most baffling subject of all. In traditional neuroscience, consciousness is frequently described as a resulting product of the brain, a consequence of intricate electrochemical processes within neural networks. This perspective has yielded remarkable discoveries about how the brain handles information, directs behavior, and enables cognition. However, it has failed to clarify why experience is present at all. The functional accounts do not succeed in explaining the qualitative nature of awareness, the simple fact that there is a subjective feeling to being conscious. Quantum theories of consciousness aim to bridge this divide by suggesting that subjective experience could stem from the uncertain, probabilistic character of quantum mechanics. Theories such as ORCR propose that quantum coherence, collapse, and entanglement inside microtubules might be the source of the unity and subjectivity of consciousness. Although the empirical proof is still not definitive, the very act of investigating this notion has propelled science into uncharted territory, questioning established beliefs and broadening the scope of what is deemed testable. Integrated information theory presents an alternative perspective, one that views consciousness as a characteristic of informational organization rather than of quantum mechanics. In this framework, the crucial factor is how information is unified, not the behavior of particles at the quantum level. This has resulted in new methods for measuring consciousness and examining its existence in a broad spectrum of biological and artificial systems. And then there is the renewed interest in panpsychism in philosophy, the concept that consciousness might be an integral part of reality itself, not arising from complexity, but being expressed through it. This view is consistent with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics that highlight the observer's role, and with theories that consider information to be more fundamental than matter. Across these varied perspectives, one thing is certain. Consciousness questions the distinction between subject and object, mind and matter, science and philosophy. It defies the neat classifications that characterize other scientific challenges. This is not a flaw. It is an indication that consciousness might call for a new type of scientific approach, one that is not hesitant to merge different fields or to question fundamental beliefs. We have observed that experiments are now starting to examine hypotheses that were once limited to theoretical discussion. Microtubules, previously considered to be purely for structure, are now being studied as possible information processors. Quantum coherence, which was long thought to be incompatible with biology, is now being seen in photosynthesis and bird navigation. Anesthetics, sleep, and altered states of consciousness are being utilized to trace the disappearance and reappearance of awareness. These initiatives have not yet settled the quantum debate, but they do indicate that it is, at the very least, a scientifically approachable question. Concurrently, the criticism remains robust and vital. The presence of quantum effects in biology does not establish that consciousness is quantum in nature. The intricacies of the brain might be attributable to classical processes that we have yet to fully comprehend. The hard problem could prove to be a non-issue, a consequence of our framing of the question rather than a sign of a gap in our physics. It is in this dynamic between theory and doubt, optimism and skepticism, that we witness the genuine process of scientific advancement. Consciousness is not the initial enigma to resist explanation. Gravity was at one time perceived as an enigmatic force that operated over a distance. Light was a source of confusion for physicists for many years. Quantum mechanics itself emerged from a point of crisis in classical physics, a collection of paradoxes that indicated the necessity for a new conceptual framework. It is possible that consciousness is guiding us towards a comparable breakthrough. If that is the case, it might not be a breakthrough of solutions, but of a new way of seeing. The way forward will probably not be a single theory that resolves the puzzle of consciousness, but rather a collection of discoveries, biological, physical, computational, and phenomenological, that, in concert, will alter our comprehension of what it is to be a mind in a physical world. There is also a moral and existential aspect to this investigation. Our understanding of consciousness shapes how we interact with other forms of life, including animals, other people, and even potential future machines. If consciousness is a common feature in the natural world, then our ethical considerations must broaden. If it can be created through engineering, then the obligations of creation become more profound. And if it is a fundamental aspect of existence, then every engagement with the world is, in a way, a meeting with awareness. In the final analysis, the question, is consciousness a quantum mystery, may be replaced by a more profound one. What kind of mystery is consciousness? Is it the type that will be solved with more precise measurements and better models? Or is it an entrance to a more comprehensive understanding of reality, one that goes beyond the conventional divisions of matter, mind, and mathematics? We may not have the complete solution yet, but we do know this. The quest for that solution is one of the most significant endeavors that science can undertake. It calls on us to investigate not only the far reaches of physics and the intricate design of the brain, but also the very nature of awareness itself, the knowing that is aware, the questioning that inquires, the presence that observes. And so the exploration goes on, not just for particles or principles, but for significance, not just for theories, but for comprehension, and not just for knowledge, but for a deeper understanding of what it means to be conscious in a universe that, in some way, is aware of itself.